The Coming Out of Maggie. Chapter 1. Plain Maggie. Every Saturday night, the Cloverleaf Social Club gave a dance in the hall of the Give and Take Athletic Association on the East Side. To be able to attend one of these dances, you had to be a member of the Give and Take Association. If you were part of the group that knew how to dance well, then it was likely that you worked in Rheingold's box factory. However, anyone who was a Cloverleaf member was sometimes allowed to bring a partner or be accompanied by a visitor to a single dance. However, most of the time, each Give and Take member brought the girl from the box factory that he liked. There were very few strangers who could say they had done a few steps at the regular Saturday night dances. Maggie Toole, because of her dull eyes, wide mouth, and poor foot control in the two-step, did not have a partner. She went to the dances with Anna McCarty and her boyfriend, Jimmy Burns. Anna and Maggie worked side by side in the factory and were the best of friends. Anna always asked Jimmy to take her around to Maggie's house every Saturday night so that Maggie could go to the dance with them. The Give and Take Athletic Association lived up to its name. The hall of the association on Orchard Street was fitted out with every type of equipment for building muscle strength. With the use of the equipment and body exercise, the muscles in the legs and arms developed, and the young men became very fit. Such strength could not be wasted, so the members were always ready to challenge the police and rival social and athletic organizations in friendly boxing matches. Between these fights, the Saturday night dance with the girls from the box factory gave the young men an opportunity to show some good manners and behave like gentlemen. However, the dances were also used as a good cover for a fight with another group. Sometimes the word went around, and if you were among the selected members of the group that walked quietly up the dark back stairs, you might see a fight as satisfying as one seen in a professional boxing ring. One particular Saturday afternoon, after Rheingold's box factory had closed at 3 p.m., Anna and Maggie walked home from work together. At Maggie's door, Anna said in her usual way, "Be ready at 7 o'clock, Maggie. Jimmy and I will come by to take you to the dance with us." What was different about today? Instead of the usual and grateful thanks from Maggie, who had never had a partner, she was a changed girl. Today, she held her head straight, and a little smile could be seen at the corners of her wide mouth. There was almost a shine in her dull brown eyes. "Thank you, Anna," answered Maggie, "but you and Jimmy needn't bother about picking me up tonight, as I have a gentleman friend that's coming by to take me to the dance." Pretty Anna grabbed her friend, held and shook her in surprise, and appealed to Maggie to tell her everything. Maggie Toole with her own partner. Plain, dear, loyal Maggie, so sweet, as an ordinary friend, but never able to get a boyfriend. Never asked for a dance or to sit under the light of the moon, on the seat in the little park. How was this, and when did it happen? "Who is it?" "You'll see tonight," said Maggie, cheeks pink with excitement at her first invitation from a man. "He's handsome, all right, 2 inches taller than Jimmy and dresses well. But I'll introduce him, Anna, as soon as we get to the hall." Anna and Jimmy were among the first Cloverleaf members to arrive that evening. Anna's bright eyes were fixed upon the door of the hall to get the first sight of the new boyfriend. At 8:30 p.m., Miss Toole entered the hall with her partner. Quickly, her proud eye discovered her friend Anna sitting with the faithful Jimmy at her side. "Well, well," cried Anna. "Maggie's made quite a catch. Handsome guy. Well, yes, I certainly would agree with his style." "Say what you like," said Jimmy, with anger in his voice. "Go after him if you want him. These new guys always win over the girls, so don't mind me. Anyway, he doesn't have all the good looks and charm." "Be quiet, Jimmy. You know what I mean. I'm glad for Maggie. First boyfriend she's ever had." "Oh, here they come." Across the floor floated Maggie like a beautiful ship in full sail, and her partner moving along beside her like a distinguished steamboat. And it was true. Maggie's friend lived up to all the words of praise that Anna had said about him. He stood 2 inches taller than the average give-and-take athlete. His dark hair was curly, his eyes were bright, and his white teeth flashed whenever he gave his frequent smiles. The young men of the Cloverleaf Club did not respect good looks in a man as much as they respected his physical strength, his success as a fighter, and his success at keeping the fight hidden from the police. The members of the association, who wanted to impress girls from the box factory, refused to put on their best clothes or even make an extra show of good manners. They were not considered important methods of getting a girlfriend. The huge arm muscles, the buttons bursting on a coat tight across the chest, and the superior and conscious male air of being the world's gift to women were considered much more important than manners. Even showing strong muscles and a pair of legs was considered an approved method for the Cloverleaf young men in competing for a girl's interest and affection. Therefore, they greeted the handsome new arrival by pretending to bow to each other and making exaggerated gestures of putting their noses in the air. Chapter 2. Charming Terry. A friend of mine, Mr. Terry O'Sullivan, was Maggie's proud way of introduction. She led him around the room, introducing him to each Cloverleaf member as they entered the door. She looked almost pretty now, with her pink cheeks and the unusual shine in her eyes that comes to a girl with her first boyfriend, not unlike a cat with its first mouse. "Maggie Toole's got a man at last," was the word that went around among the girls from the box factory. "Welcome him in with trumpet music," said the men from the Give and Take Athletic Association, sounding bored and insulting. Usually at the weekly dances, Maggie sat by herself at the side of the hall. In fact, she kept the chair warm most of the evening. She felt and showed so much relief and pleasure whenever a partner invited her to dance that his kindness in asking her lost all value and satisfaction. She had even grown used to noticing Anna touch the not always willing Jimmy with her elbow as she signaled for him to invite Maggie to dance. In the two-step that usually followed, Jimmy always prepared himself for Maggie's heavy feet to stamp on his toes as she tried without success to keep in time with the music. Tonight, everything changed for Maggie, as charming Terry O'Sullivan danced her around the floor in victory. Miss Maggie Toole tasted the first joy of having a partner like every other girl. And although our feelings of magic are mixed with very human events, nothing could ruin the success of Maggie's one perfect night. The girls gathered around and pressed her for introductions to her partner. The Cloverleaf young men, after 2 years of not noticing Maggie at all, suddenly discovered the charms of the interesting Miss Toole. They stretched their huge muscles in front of her and asked her to save them a dance. Thus, Maggie had an exciting and very happy evening. However, the honors of the evening fell thick and fast to Terry O'Sullivan. He showed off his curls, he smiled, and went easily through the 7 movements of a series of body exercises which are usually kept to perform in private each morning. He danced as lightly as a feather. He carried himself with style and introduced an atmosphere of perfect behavior to the other less than perfect young men. He spoke soft and romantic words and always found the correct thing to say to every girl. He danced twice, one after the other, with the girl from the box factory, who came with Dempsey Donovan. Dempsey was the leader of the Give and Take Athletic Association. He wore a business suit and could raise his chin to rest it on the exercise bar twice, using only one hand. He was one of Big Mike O'Sullivan's support men and was never troubled by violence or any other crime, as no policeman dared to arrest him. Whenever he broke the head of a person selling fruit in the market or shot a member of the Hendrick B. Sweeney Outing and Literary Association in the knee, an officer would call around and say, "The captain would like to see you for a few minutes around in the office, when you have time, Dempsey, my boy." When he arrived at the police station, there would be a number of gentlemen standing around with large gold watch chains and black cigarettes. Somebody would tell a funny story, and the crimes of Dempsey would be forgotten. Dempsey would go back and work out for half an hour with the heaviest weights any man could lift. Everybody thought it would be safer walking along a tight wire stretched across the water of Niagara Falls compared to dancing twice with Dempsey Donovan's girlfriend from the box factory. At 10 o'clock, the happy, round face of Big Mike O'Sullivan appeared at the door, and for 5 minutes he looked around at the scene in the hall. Every Saturday night, he always looked in at the dance for 5 minutes, smiled at the girls, and handed out expensive cigarettes to the delighted boys. Dempsey Donovan moved up to Big Mike's side at once, talking quickly. Big Mike looked carefully at the dancers, smiled, shook his head, and left the hall. The music stopped, and the dancers moved off the floor to the chairs along the walls. Terry O'Sullivan, with a charming bow, returned a pretty girl in a blue dress to her partner and walked back to find Maggie. Dempsey stopped him in the middle of the floor. Some inner feeling that seems to have been born within all of us must have caused nearly everyone to turn and look at the two men staring at each other in the hall. There was a deep feeling that they were like two ancient fighters who had met on the battleground. 2 or 3 give-and-take members, bending tight muscles and their coat sleeves, moved closer. "Just a moment, Mr. O'Sullivan," said Dempsey. "I do hope you are enjoying yourself at our dance. Where did you say you live?" The two men were well matched. Dempsey was possibly 10 pounds less in weight than O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan was broad and very quick in movement. Dempsey had a cold eye, a thin mouth held tightly in control, a strong jaw, smooth skin, and the calm nature of a winner. The visitor showed more emotion in his behavior and less control over his insulting attitude to the other man. They were natural enemies, by the law written, when the earth was first shaped. They were each too superior, too proud, and too confident to divide the attention between them. Only one man would survive. Chapter 3. Fight for a Happy Outcome. "I live on Grand," said O'Sullivan rudely, "and there's no trouble to find me at home. Where do you live?" Dempsey ignored the question. "You say your name's O'Sullivan," he went on. "Well, Big Mike says he's never seen you before." "He's never seen lots of things," said the popular man at the dance that night. "As a rule," went on Dempsey, with a sweet tone of voice, "the O'Sullivans in this district know one another. You brought one of our lady members here, and we need to know a little about you. If you've got a family history, let's see where you fit into the O'Sullivan family. Or do you want us to drag the information out of you by the roots of your hair?" "Suppose you mind your own business," suggested O'Sullivan quietly. Dempsey's eyes shone. He held up a finger, as though a brilliant idea had just struck him. "I've got it now," he said politely. "It was just a little mistake, because you're not an O'Sullivan. You're a tree-climbing rat. Excuse us for not recognizing you at first." O'Sullivan's eyes flashed as he made a quick movement, but Andy Gogan was ready and caught hold of his arm. Dempsey nodded at Andy and William McMahon, the secretary of the club, and walked quickly toward a door at the back of the hall. 2 other members hurried after them and joined the little group. Terry O'Sullivan was now in the hands of the Board of Rules and Social Judges. They spoke to him briefly and softly and accompanied him out through a door at the rear. This activity on the part of the Cloverleaf members requires a word of explanation. At the back of the association hall was a smaller room rented by the club. In this room, personal problems that started on the dance floor were settled, man to man. It was hand-to-hand fighting only, and the fights were all controlled by the board of the social club. No lady could say that she had witnessed a fight at a Cloverleaf dance for several years. Its gentlemen members guaranteed that it would remain that way. So easily and smoothly had Dempsey and the board done their preparation that most people in the hall had not noticed that the charming O'Sullivan's social victory had come to an end. Among these was Maggie, as she looked about for her partner. "There's trouble," said Rose Cassidy. "Didn't you see? Dempsey Donovan picked a fight with your pretty boy, and they've danced out to the killing room together. How does my hair look done up this way, Maggie?" Maggie placed a hand over her heart. "Gone to fight with Dempsey?" she said in alarm. "They've got to be stopped. Dempsey Donovan can't fight him. Why, he'll kill him." "Well, who cares?" said Rose. "Don't some of them fight every Saturday night?" Maggie was off, running through the mass of dancers. She burst through the rear door into the dark hall and put her solid shoulder against the door of the back room. The door opened, and the instant she entered the room, she saw the whole scene. The board of the club was standing around the floor, with their watches open to time the fight. Dempsey Donovan had rolled up his sleeves and was dancing on his toes with the careful skill of the modern boxer, but within easy reach of his enemy. Terry O'Sullivan was standing with his arms folded and a look of murder in his dark eyes. Not even stopping for a minute, Maggie jumped forward with a scream. She jumped in time to catch and hang on the arm of O'Sullivan that was suddenly lifted up in the air, just in time to grab from his hand a long, thin knife that he had pulled from his shirt. The knife fell to the floor with a loud ring. Cold steel pulled in a fight in the rooms of the Give and Take Association. Such a thing had never happened before. Everyone stood still for a minute. Andy Gogan kicked the knife with the toe of his shoe, in a curious way. He looked a bit like an ancient traveler who had found an old weapon that he had never seen before. O'Sullivan, with his mouth almost closed, whispered something no one could understand. Dempsey and the board members looked at each other. Dempsey looked at O'Sullivan without anger, as if looking at a lost dog, and nodded his head in the direction of the door. "Use the back stairs, foreigner," he said briefly. "Someone will throw your hat down after you." Maggie walked up to Dempsey Donovan. There was a brilliant spot of red in her cheeks, where slow tears were running down. With great courage she looked up at Dempsey's face. "I knew him, Dempsey," she said, as her eyes grew dull, even through her tears. "I knew where he came from. His name's Tony Spinelli. I hurried in when they told me you and he were fighting. That family always carries knives, but you don't understand, Dempsey. I never had a boyfriend in my life. I got so tired of coming with Anna and Jimmy every night that I made an arrangement with Spinelli to call himself O'Sullivan and brought him along as my partner. I knew he wouldn't get into the hall if he used his real name. I suppose I'll have to leave the club now?" Dempsey turned to Andy Gogan. "Throw that knife out the window," he said, "and tell everyone inside the hall that Mr. O'Sullivan has received a telephone message and has had to leave on urgent business." Then he turned back to Maggie. "Say, Maggie," he said, "I'd like to take you home. What about next Saturday night? Will you come to the dance with me?" It was remarkable how quickly Maggie's eyes could change from dull to a shining brown. "With you, Dempsey?" she managed to reply. "Do you think I'd really say no?"
The Outcasts of Poker Flat. Chapter 1. Sent Out of Town. When Mr. John Oakhurst, a gambler, stepped into the main street of Poker Flat on the morning of the 23rd of November, 1850, he was conscious of a change in the mood of the camp since the night before. 2 or 3 men who were talking quietly together stopped as he approached and exchanged significant looks. It felt like a Sunday, and in a place quite free of any church influences. It looked threatening. Mr. Oakhurst's calm, handsome face showed no concern about these signs. Whether he was conscious of any reason for the alarm was another question. "I reckon they're after somebody," he thought. "Maybe it's me." He put the handkerchief back in his pocket after cleaning away the red dust of the camp town of Poker Flat from his neat boots. Quietly he turned away and put all ideas of trouble out of his mind. It was true. Poker Flat was after somebody. The camp had lately been robbed of several $1,000s, 2 valuable horses, and a leading citizen. People were reacting to the crime in a way that was just as much outside the law as the crime itself. A secret committee had decided to rid the town of all the people they did not consider suitable residents. The getting rid of was done permanently in regards to 2 men who were hanging from the branches of a tree in the canyon, and temporarily in the casting out of certain other awful characters. It is a shame to say that some of these characters were ladies. It is fair to note, however, that the women's bad behavior was due only to their professional activities. It was the immoral profession of the women of which the people of Poker Flat sat in judgment. Mr. Oakhurst was right in supposing that he was included in the category of awful characters. A few of the committee had suggested hanging him as an example to other people. It would also be a sure method of getting the money back that he had won from them in a poker game. "It's against justice," said Jim Wheeler, "to let this young man from Roaring Camp, an absolute stranger, take away our money." The rough sense of fair play in the hearts of those people who had been lucky enough to win money from Mr. Oakhurst overcame the narrow local view. Mr. Oakhurst received his sentence calmly, particularly because he was aware of the doubt of his judges. He was too much of a gambler not to accept his bad luck. With him, life was at most an uncertain game, and he recognized the odds were always in favor of the one who held the best cards. A group of armed men accompanied the outcasts of Poker Flat to the edge of the camp. The armed guard was provided to control Mr. Oakhurst, who was known to be a daring and desperate man. There were also several others in the group, a young woman known as the Duchess, another called Mother Shipton, and Uncle Billy, a confirmed alcoholic, also thought to be a robber of gold dust. The spectators made no comments about the group, and no words were spoken by the guards. Only when they reached the canyon which marked the outside limit of Poker Flat did the leader speak briefly and to the point. The outcasts were not allowed to return, or they would lose their lives. As the guards disappeared, the outcasts let out their emotions. There were a few dramatic tears from the Duchess, some bad language from Mother Shipton, and a huge string of swear words from Uncle Billy. The accepting Mr. Oakhurst said nothing, but listened calmly to Mother Shipton's desire to cut somebody's heart out. He heard the repeated statements of the Duchess that she would die on the road, and the constant swearing coming from Uncle Billy as he rode ahead. With goodwill and humor, Mr. Oakhurst insisted on exchanging his own strong horse 5-Spot for the poor animal which the Duchess rode. Even this kind act did nothing to bring the group any closer. The young woman fixed her hair with a shake of her head. Mother Shipton stared at Mr. Oakhurst with dislike, and Uncle Billy looked over the whole group in disgust. The road to Sandy Bar, a camp that had not yet been developed as much as Poker Flat, seemed to offer some hope for the outcasts. It lay over a steep mountain range and was a day's hard ride away. The party soon rode out of the damp, warm regions of the valleys into the dry, cold air of the mountains. The track was narrow and difficult, and at noon the Duchess rolled off her tired animal and said she was going no further. The spot was particularly wild and impressive. A level area of forest was surrounded on 3 sides by the steep rock faces that sloped gently toward the top of another hill that looked down over the valley. It was the most suitable place for a camp, but Mr. Oakhurst knew that they were not even halfway to Sandy Bar. The group was not prepared, nor did they have enough food for a delay. Mr. Oakhurst pointed out this fact to the travelers. He made a smart remark on the silly idea of giving up before they had finished the journey. However, they had plenty of alcohol, which in this emergency helped them in place of food, fuel, rest, and the knowledge of what lay ahead. In spite of Mr. Oakhurst's care, it was not long before they were more or less under its influence. Uncle Billy changed quickly from wanting to fight into a nearly unconscious state. The Duchess became emotional, and Mother Shipton breathed loudly through her nose. Only Mr. Oakhurst stayed awake, calmly leaning against a rock and watching them. Chapter 2. Tom and Piney joined the outcasts. Mr. Oakhurst did not drink alcohol. It got in the way of a profession which required a cool head, blank face, and quick thinking. He stared at his sleepy fellow outcasts. Suddenly, for the first time, the lack of company from his lonely trade, his habits of life, and his faults made him unhappy. He kept himself busy by removing the dust from his black clothes, washing his face and hands, and doing all the other usual actions characteristic of his neat habits. For a short time, he forgot his unhappy thoughts. The idea of leaving his weaker and less able fellow travelers probably never occurred to Mr. Oakhurst, yet he could not help feeling the need for some excitement. Strangely enough, it was danger that produced that calm appearance for which he was known. He looked at the steep rocks that rose 1,000 feet above the ring of pine trees and around him. He watched the dark clouds in the sky and saw the valley below already becoming covered in shadow. Suddenly, he heard his own name called. A horse and man slowly climbed the track. Mr. Oakhurst recognized the young face of Tom Simpson, otherwise known as the Innocent of Sandy Bar. He had met him some months before at a poker game. Using presence of mind, he had won about $40 from that innocent youth. After the game was finished, Mr. Oakhurst spoke to the young gambler softly behind the door and said, "Tommy, you're a good little man, but you're no gambler. Don't ever try it again." He then handed him his money back, and pushed him gently from the room, and thus made himself a devoted friend of Tom Simpson. Tommy greeted Mr. Oakhurst in his fresh and enthusiastic way. "I had started," he said, "to go to Poker Flat to seek my fortune." "Alone?" "No, not exactly alone," he said, laughing. In fact, he had run away with Piney Woods. Didn't Mr. Oakhurst remember Piney? She was the girl that used to wait on the tables at the Temperance House. They had been engaged a long time, but old Jake Woods had objected, so they had run away. They were going to Poker Flat to be married, and here they were. And they were tired out, and how lucky it was they had found company and a place to camp. All this the Innocent said quickly, while Piney, a fat, pretty girl of 15, rode out from behind the pine tree, where she had been hiding with embarrassment. She stood next to the two men. Mr. Oakhurst seldom troubled himself with emotion, still less with proper behavior, but he felt that it was not a good situation. However, he kept his presence of mind sufficiently to kick Uncle Billy, who was about to say something. Despite the alcohol, Uncle Billy was aware of what the kick meant, and that he had better take notice of Mr. Oakhurst. He then tried to encourage Tom Simpson to ride on, and even pointed out that there were no plans for or means of making a camp. But that didn't help, as the Innocent met this comment by assuring the party that he was provided with an extra animal loaded with food. Also, he had discovered a rough wooden hut near the track. "Piney can stay with Mr. Oakhurst," said the Innocent, pointing to the Duchess, "and I can look after myself." Nothing but Mr. Oakhurst's kicking foot saved Uncle Billy from bursting into a shout of laughter. As it was, he had to go further up the canyon until he could control his delight. There he told the joke to the tall pine trees, hitting the side of his leg with his hand and pulling faces and swearing in his usual way. When he returned to the group, he found them seated by a fire in an apparently friendly conversation. The air had grown strangely cold, and the sky was dark. Piney was talking in her young, enthusiastic way to the Duchess, who was listening with interest and excitement she had not shown for many days. The Innocent was talking, obviously with equal effect, to Mr. Oakhurst and Mother Shipton, who was actually becoming quite friendly. "Do you think you're on a picnic?" asked Uncle Billy, with disgust as he looked over the happy group, the dancing flames, and the animals tied up nearby. Suddenly an idea mixed with the alcohol affected his brain. It was apparently of a funny nature, for he felt the need to hit his leg again and push his hand into his mouth. As the shadows moved slowly up the mountain, a slight wind blew through the tops of the pine trees and whistled through the long rows of branches. The ruined hut, repaired and covered with broken pines, was set apart for the ladies. As Tom and Piney said good night, they exchanged a kiss, so honest and sincere that it could have been heard above the whistling trees. The weak Duchess and the unfriendly Mother Shipton were probably too surprised to remark upon this last simple action, and so, without a word, went into the hut. More wood was put on the fire, the men lay down in front of the door, and in a few minutes, everyone was asleep. Mr. Oakhurst slept lightly. Toward morning, he woke up stiff and cold. As he stirred the dying fire, the wind, which had now gathered strength, blew something on his cheek which filled him with fear. Snow. He stood up with the intention of waking the others, for there was no time to lose. Turning to where Uncle Billy had been lying, he found he was gone. He was immediately suspicious and said a few words under his breath. He ran to the spot where the animals had been tied, but they were no longer there. The tracks were already disappearing quickly in the snow. Chapter 3. Snowed In. Despite the excitement of the missing animals, Mr. Oakhurst came back to the fire with his usual calm. He did not wake the group. The Innocent slept peacefully with a smile on his pleasant face, and the honest Piney slept beside the other women. Mr. Oakhurst, pulling his blanket over his shoulders, stroked his beard and waited for the dawn. It came slowly in a spinning cloud of snow, and what could still be seen of the country now appeared to be covered in a magic blanket of white. Mr. Oakhurst looked over the valley and considered the situation in 2 words: snowed in. There was a careful check of the supplies, which, by luck for the group, had been stored inside the hut. They had escaped the stealing fingers of Uncle Billy and showed that with care and good judgment they might last for 10 days. "That is," said Mr. Oakhurst quietly to the innocent, "if you're willing to let us stay here. If you aren't, could we wait until Uncle Billy gets back with more food?" For some unknown reason, Mr. Oakhurst could not bring himself to discuss Uncle Billy's dishonesty. He suggested that Billy had wandered from the camp and had accidentally frightened the animals. He warned the Duchess and Mother Shipton, who of course knew exactly what Uncle Billy had done. "Tom and Piney will find out the truth about us all eventually," he added with meaning, "and it's no good frightening them now." Tom Simpson not only gave everything he owned to Mr. Oakhurst to use, but seemed to enjoy the thought of all of them being snowed in together. "We'll have a good camp for a week. The snow will melt and we'll all go back to Poker Flat." The cheerful nature of the young man and Mr. Oakhurst's calm manner spread to the others. The innocent used some strong pine branches to construct a roof for the hut. The Duchess showed Piney how to arrange everything inside with a skill that impressed the little country girl. "I reckon now you're used to fine things in Poker Flat," said Piney. The Duchess turned away quickly to hide a thought that caused her cheeks to turn pink, even through the artificial color she had put on them earlier. Mother Shipton asked Piney not to talk so much. When Mr. Oakhurst returned from a tiring search for the tracks, he heard the sound of laughter coming from the camp. He stopped in alarm, and naturally, his first thoughts were about the alcohol which he had carefully hidden. "Somehow it doesn't sound like the alcohol," thought the gambler. It was not until he caught sight of the bright fire through the heavy snow and the group around it that he felt sure the enjoyment was genuine. Whether Mr. Oakhurst had hidden his poker cards with the alcohol to stop anyone from using them, I cannot say. It was certain, though, in Mother Shipton's words, that he didn't say cards once during the evening. The time was very happily passed with the music provided by Tom Simpson. With some difficulty in using the instrument, Piney Woods managed to produce several tunes from its keys. The innocent accompanied Piney by hitting 2 pieces of bone together. However, the best moment of the evening was reached when Tom and Piney sang a rough camp version of a religious song in loud and enthusiastic voices. I doubt that the tone of the song was particularly holy, but the spirit of the tune quickly spread to the others, who eventually joined in the chorus. "I'm proud to live in the service of the Lord, and I'm bound to die in His army." The pines shook in the storm blew showers of snow above the unlucky group. The flames of their fire pointed toward heaven as if they had made a holy promise. At midnight, the storm died down, the rolling clouds moved apart, and the stars shone clearly above the sleeping camp. Mr. Oakhurst, whose professional habits had taught him to live on the smallest possible amount of sleep, shared the watch with Tom Simpson. Somehow, he managed to do a longer part of the night. He explained about himself to the innocent by saying that he had often gone a week without sleep. "Doing what?" asked Tom. "Poker," replied Oakhurst seriously. "When a man gets a run of good luck, he doesn't get tired. The luck gives in first. Luck," continued the gambler in a thoughtful way, "is a very odd thing. All you know about it is that for certain it is sure to change, and it's knowing when it's going to change that makes you a good gambler. We had a run of bad luck since we left Poker Flat. You come along, Tom, and now you're in it too. If you can hold your cards right through the game, you'll be fine because," sang the gambler in a rude but cheerful voice, "I'm proud to live in the service of the Lord, and I'm bound to die in His army." The third day came, and the sun overlooking the White Valley saw the outcasts divide their slowly disappearing store of food for the morning meal. It was one of the strange facts of mountain climate that the sun spreads warmth over the cold land as if it is sorry for not shining during the storm. As the sky cleared, it revealed piles of snow around the hut. There were no tracks to guide the outcasts through the sea of white. Through the clear air, the smoke of the Poker Flat camp rose miles away. Mother Shipton saw it and from a high rock shouted some final angry words. "It did me good," she privately told the Duchess. "Just you go out there and swear and you'll know." She then set about amusing the child, as she and the Duchess liked to call Piney. Piney was no baby, but it pleased them to call her a child because she didn't use bad language and she knew the difference between right and wrong. Chapter 4. Cold Outcomes. When night came up again through the canyons, the weak notes of the musical instrument rose and fell in stops and starts. For the group around the fire, the music did not fill the gap left by the lack of food. A new entertainment was suggested by Piney, telling stories. Neither Mr. Oakhurst nor the female travelers cared to relate their personal experiences, so this plan might have failed but for the innocent. Some months earlier, he had come across a copy of the Iliad. He now decided to tell the main story of the poem in the modern language of Sandy Bar. And so for the rest of that night, the Greek gods again walked the earth. Greek tough guy and Greek smart guy fought in the forests, and even the great pine trees in the canyon seemed to bow to the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus. Mr. Oakhurst listened with quiet satisfaction. He was most interested in what happened to Achilles, as the innocent kept calling the rapid Achilles. So, with very little food, much of Homer's Iliad, and the music, the Outcasts passed another week. There was no sun, and snow fell from the gray skies over the land. Day by day, the circle of white around them became closer, until at last they looked out from their prison at piles of snow 20 feet above their heads. It became more and more difficult to light their fires, even using the trees half hidden in the snow beside them. And yet, no one complained. Tom and Piney turned away from the awful situation, looked into each other's eyes, and were happy. Mr. Oakhurst settled himself calmly and accepted that this was a game he would not win. The Duchess, more cheerful than she had been, assumed the care of Piney. Only Mother Shipton, once the strongest of the party, seemed to become ill and pale, and at midnight on the 10th day, she called Oakhurst to her side. "I'm going," she said in a weak voice of complaint, "but don't say anything to the others. Take the parcel from under my head and open it." Mr. Oakhurst did so. It contained Mother Shipton's food supplies for the past week. "Give it to the child," she said, pointing to the sleeping Piney. "You have gone hungry," said the gambler. "That's what they call it," said the woman faintly, as she lay down again, and turning her face to the wall, she died. The music and the bones were put aside that day, and Homer was forgotten as the body of Mother Shipton was buried in the snow. Mr. Oakhurst took the innocent aside and showed him a pair of shoes suitable for traveling over snow, which he had made from an old piece of leather. "There's one chance in 100 to save her yet," he said, pointing to Piney, "but it's over there," he added, pointing toward Poker Flat. "If you can reach there in 2 days, she's safe." "And you?" asked Tom Simpson. "I'll stay here," was the short reply. Tom and Piney moved apart after the long kiss. "You are not going, are you?" asked the Duchess, as she saw Mr. Oakhurst waiting to accompany Tom. "As far as the canyon," he replied. He turned suddenly and kissed the Duchess, leaving her pale face pink with color and her shaking body stiff with surprise. Night came and brought the storm and falling snow again. There was no sign of Mr. Oakhurst. The Duchess, putting wood on the fire, found that someone had quietly put enough fuel beside the hut to last a few days longer. The tears came to her eyes, but she hid them from Piney. The women slept very little, and in the morning looked at each other without words, accepting their desperate situation. Piney, taking the strongest position, put her arm around the Duchess's waist. They stayed like this for the rest of the day. That night, the wild storm entered the hut. Toward morning, they could not light the fire. The Duchess stepped closer to Piney and broke the silence of many hours. "Piney, can you pray?" "No, dear," said Piney simply. The Duchess felt a sense of relief, without knowing exactly why, and putting her head on Piney's shoulder, said no more. There they fell asleep. The woman cast out of town for her immoral activities, resting her head on the shoulder of her young and innocent friend. The wind was quiet and shook snow from the long pine branches over them as they slept. The moon, shining through the gaps in the clouds, looked down on what had been the camp, but all traces of human struggle were now hidden beneath the white blanket of snow. They slept all that day, and the next, and did not wake when voices and steps broke the silence of the camp. When sympathetic fingers cleared the snow from their white faces, it was impossible to tell from the peaceful expressions which woman had remained moral and which had not. Even the law of Poker Flat recognized this and turned away, leaving them still locked in each other's arms. At the top of the canyon, on one of the largest pine trees, they found the two of clubs fixed to the branch with a knife. It said the following words written in pencil with a strong hand. Beneath this tree lies the body of John Oakhurst, who struck a run of bad luck on the 23rd of November, 1850, and handed in his cards on the 7th of December, 1850. Still calm as in life, with a gun by his side and a bullet in his heart, he lay cold and dead under the snow. He was at the same time the strongest and yet the weakest of the outcasts of Poker Flat.
The Spectre Bridegroom. Chapter 1. The Bride. On top of the Odenwald Mountains of northern Germany lies a wild and beautiful area of land. It is situated near the junction of the Main and the Rhine rivers. The castle of the Baron von Landshort stood there many years ago. The castle is now in ruins and almost buried among dark old mountain trees. High above the castle, the walls of an observation tower once used to keep watch over the surrounding countries still stand. The Baron was a member of the great family of Katzenelnbogen. He had been handed down the remains of the estate and all the family pride that came with the property. He did not have a son to whom he could hand down the castle and land. Many of the family possessions had been lost in the constant fighting of his ancient relatives. However, the Baron still tried to keep up some show of their former elegant way of life. The times were peaceful, and the German nobles, in general, had abandoned the uncomfortable old castles. Most had built more convenient houses in the valleys. The Baron still remained in his castle, proud of his ancient history, but keeping alive all the old family quarrels. In this way, he was still on bad terms with some of his nearest neighbors, because of arguments that had happened hundreds of years earlier. The Baron only had one child, but as so often happens where there are no other children, nature makes up for the lack by creating a single brilliant human being. This is how it was with the daughter of the Baron. All the people in the town, and even people around the country, assured her father that his daughter was the most beautiful person in Germany. Who would know better than they? As well as having beauty, the daughter had been brought up with great care under the protection of two single aunts. The aunts had spent several years of their early lives at one of the little German courts. This experience had given them all the necessary knowledge for the education of a fine lady. Under their instructions, their niece became a young woman with many wonderful gifts. By the time she was 18, she could sew perfectly. She sewed pictures of many religious figures on material with such skill that the faces of the people showed real emotions. She could read well and had worked her way through several religious stories and almost all the brave adventures of the heroes of national German poetry. She had even made considerable progress in writing and could sign her own name without missing a letter. It was very clear, and her aunts could read it without glasses. She was particularly good at making pretty but useless little gifts of all kinds. She was even able to do all the most difficult modern dance steps and played a number of tunes on the guitar. She could play every love song of the early German poets by Harte. Her aunts, having been very lively when they were young, made the rules of behavior very strict for their niece. It is an interesting fact that there is no person so wise and well-behaved as one who has been very wild herself as a young person. The niece was rarely allowed out of the aunt's sight. She was never allowed outside the castle without company. She had constant lectures on how to behave well and obey everyone. As for men, she was taught to keep them at a distance and certainly not trust any one in particular. So strict were the aunts about this that, unless she had been given permission, she would not even have looked at the most handsome man in the world. The good effects of the strict rules were quite obvious. The young lady was an example of perfect behavior and duty. While other girls were amusing themselves out in the world, she was developing into a lovely woman under the protection of the careful aunts. She was like a beautiful rose growing between two sharp points. Her aunts looked at her with pride and joy and said, "Although all the other young ladies in the world might do wrong, thank heaven, nothing like that could happen to the daughter of the Baron of Katzenelnbogen." There was a constant stream of visitors to the castle. Circumstances had given him a huge number of poor relations. The relations all loved him and took every opportunity to arrive in large numbers and bring pleasure to the castle. All family festivals were celebrated by these happy people at the Baron's expense. After they had eaten his good food and drank huge quantities of wine, they would declare that there was nothing on earth as enjoyable as these family dinners. The Baron, although a small man, had a very generous heart. It gave him a feeling of great satisfaction to think he was the top man in his little world. He loved to tell long stories about the severe, old relatives whose pictures looked down from the castle walls. He always found his guests to be a good audience. He believed in, and was very interested in, the ghost stories that were told in every village in Germany. His guests had even more faith than the Baron in the ghost stories, and listened to every strange account with surprise and wonder. They never ceased to be amazed, even though they had heard the stories over and over before. This is how the Baron von Landshort, the head of his castle, and the king of his little region lived. He was quite sure that he was the smartest man of the age. Chapter 2. The Fatal Meeting. At the time of this story, there was a great family gathering at the castle to meet the promised bridegroom of the Baron's daughter. An arrangement had been made between the Baron and an old nobleman of Bavaria for a marriage between their children. It would increase the importance of both families. The initial plans had been made in the usual way. The young people were engaged without having met each other, and the date set for the wedding. The young Count von Altenburg had been recalled from the army and was on his way to the castle to meet his promised bride. Messages had been received from Würzburg, where he was accidentally delayed. The messages indicated the day and time when he might be expected to arrive. The castle was in a fever of preparation to provide him with a suitable welcome. The pretty bride had dressed with particular care. The two aunts had selected her clothing and quarreled all morning about what she should wear. The young lady had taken advantage of their arguments to wear exactly what she wanted, and had chosen very well. She looked as beautiful as any young bridegroom could wish for, and the excitement made her look even lovelier. The aunts constantly directed her, as single aunts usually take a great interest in the love affairs of others. They were giving her the final instructions on how to behave, what to say, and how to greet her intended husband. The Baron was just as busy with his preparations. He really had nothing to do, but being a naturally busy little man, he could not remain still when everyone else was rushing about the place. He walked from top to bottom of the castle looking anxious. He continually called the servants from their work and then told them to work hard. He raced from room to room, as useless as a fly on a warm summer's day. Meanwhile, the meat had been prepared for the celebration. The kitchen was full of good food. Bottles of red and white wine had been brought up from the basement. Even a huge drum of Heidelberg beer was laid out. Everything was ready to greet the distinguished visitor in the true spirit of a German welcome. But there was still no sign of him. Hour by hour passed. The sun, which had been so warm over the rich forests of the Odenwald, was now setting along the tops of the mountains. The Baron went to the tallest tower in the castle to see if he could see any sign of the Count and his escorts. Once he thought he saw them. The sound of horns came floating up from the valley. A party of men was seen far below, riding slowly along the road. It was a false alarm, for when they reached the foot of the mountain, they suddenly rode off in a different direction. The sun by now had set, and the bats began to fly about in the evening light. It was getting dark, and the only movement on the road was the occasional worker returning home. While the old castle of Landshort was in a state of confusion, a very interesting scene was taking place in a different part of the Odenwald Mountains. The young Count von Altenburg was calmly riding toward his engagement without feeling any need to hurry. After all, the arrangement was definite, and the bride would certainly be waiting for him at the end of the journey. While the Count was in Würzburg, he had met a young soldier with whom he had fought on the German borders. Hermann von Starkenfast, one of the most loyal and brave soldiers of the German army, was returning home to his father's castle. The castle was not very far from the castle of Baron von Landshort. Due to an ancient quarrel, the two families were enemies and total strangers to each other. In the warm moments of meeting, the young friends shared all their past adventures. The Count related the details of his intended marriage to a young lady he had never met. He added that he had been given excellent references about her beauty and character. As the route of the friends lay in the same direction, they agreed to travel the rest of the way together. If they set off from Würzburg early, there would be no need to hurry. The Count had given instructions for his escorts to follow him and then go on ahead. When the Count was not talking about the beauty and nature of his intended bride, they passed the time remembering battles they had fought side by side. Still talking, they were crossing one of the most lonely and thick forest passes in the Odenwald Mountains. It is well known that the forests of Germany have always been occupied with as many robbers as the German castles have had ghosts. At this time, the robbers were in particularly high numbers due to the groups of former soldiers wandering about the country. It is not surprising, then, that the two men were attacked by a pack in the middle of the woods. They defended themselves bravely, but had nearly lost the fight when the Count's escorts arrived and came to their aid. At sight of the Count's men, the robbers ran away, but not before the Count had received a deadly wound. He was slowly and carefully taken back to Würzburg. A religious brother with medical knowledge was called from nearby, but it was too late. With his dying breath, the Count asked his friend to go at once to the castle of Landshort and explain the reason for him not keeping the appointment with his bride. Although not the most enthusiastic of lovers, the Count was a sincere man and was concerned that the message reached the castle quickly. "Unless this is done," he said, "I will not rest quietly in my grave." Starkenfaust tried to calm him and promised to do as he was asked. He held out his hand to the Count, and the dying man pressed it in thanks, but soon fell into a confused mental state. He talked about his bride, his promised engagement, and his horse, and then died in the imagined act of jumping onto the animal's back. Chapter 3. Deception. Starkenfaust breathed heavily and cried a brave tear about the early death of his friend. He was worried about the difficult task he had agreed to carry out. He also felt anxious that he had to go as an unknown guest to unfriendly people and end their hopes and joy with such bad news. However, he was curious to meet this famous beauty so carefully shut away from the world in Katzenelnbogen. Starkenfaust was a daring man and a great admirer of women. He thought to himself that he was very interested in this odd situation that might even turn into an adventure. Before he left, he made all the necessary funeral arrangements for the burial of his friend in the Württemberg church. The Count was to be buried near a number of his famous relatives, so his body was left in the care of his unwilling escorts. Meanwhile, the ancient family of Katzenelnbogen was waiting impatiently for their guest, and even more for their dinner. The good little Baron was still up on the tower, not knowing what to do next. Night closed in, but still no visitor had arrived. The Baron came down from the tower in a state of deep melancholy. The meal, which had already been kept warm for hours, could no longer be delayed. The meat was already dried out, the cook upset, and the whole household had the look of an army that hadn't been fed for weeks. The Baron was forced to give orders for the meal to start without the expected guest. Everyone was seated at the table ready to start eating when the sound of a horn from outside the castle gave warning that someone was coming. Another long sound was answered by the guard on the castle walls. The Baron hurried to greet his daughter's future bridegroom. The bride had been dropped down as the stranger came through the gate. He was a tall, handsome soldier, sitting high on a black horse. His eyes were bright and observant in a pale face, and he sat with a look of impressive melancholy. The Baron was ashamed and annoyed that the soldier arrived on his own. At first, he considered the man had not shown proper respect for the important occasion or for the important family he would be joining. Later, he calmed himself, thinking that it was due to impatience that the young man had ridden alone. "I am sorry," said the stranger, "to impose on you at such a time." Here the Baron interrupted him with words of praise and welcome, because he was proud of his good manners and speech. The stranger tried to interrupt the flow of words several times without success. Finally, he bowed his head politely and waited. By the time the Baron paused, they had reached the inner court of the castle, and the stranger tried again to speak. This time he was interrupted by the arrival of the aunts, leading out the embarrassed bride. He stared at the beautiful girl in delight, and wondered if he was dreaming. One of the aunts whispered something in the bride's ear. She raised her blue eyes to look shyly at the stranger, and made an effort to speak. She looked down again, and the words died away. There was a sweet smile on her face which showed she was pleased with what she saw. It was impossible for a girl of 18, interested in love and marriage, not to be pleased with such a handsome bridegroom. The guest had arrived too late for any further conversation that night, so the Baron led the way to the dining tables. The food was served in the great hall of the castle. Around the walls hung the severe faces and battle prizes of the heroes of the house of Katzenelnbogen. The soldier took little notice of the company or the entertainment. He hardly tasted the food, but seemed absorbed in admiration of his bride. He spoke in a low voice that could not be heard by other people. What female could not hear the softest whisper of her lover? His serious but kind manner appeared to have a powerful effect on the young lady. Her face was pink as she listened to him with deep attention. Occasionally, she made some shy reply. When he turned away, she would take a quick look at his handsome face and breathe out with happiness. It was obvious that the young couple was attracted to each other. The aunts, who knew all about the ways of romance, declared that they had fallen in love with each other at first sight. The meal went on happily and noisily, for the guests all had the healthy interest in food that goes with the fresh mountain air, and very little money of their own. The Baron told his best and longest stories, and had never told them so well or with such great effect. When he spoke of something strange, the guests were amazed. If his speech were funny, everyone laughed in the right places. The Baron, like most great men, was too proper to tell a joke that was rude. However, even his dull jokes were always made better by some excellent wine. Other people told the rude jokes that could only be told at a special celebration. Many sly comments were whispered in the ladies' ears that made them laugh behind their hands. Sometimes a song or two sung by a poor but drunk cousin of the Baron absolutely made the single aunts hide their faces. Chapter 4. Appointment with the Grave. All through the party, the guest looked unusually serious. His face became more gloomy as the evening progressed. As strange as it seems, the Baron's jokes seemed to make him even more melancholy. At times he was lost in thought, and at times there was a worried expression on his face that indicated an anxious mind. His conversations with the bride became more and more serious and mysterious. Her happy face began to lose its look of joy, and assumed a troubled expression as her gentle body began to shake with fear. All these changes were seen by everyone in the great hall. Their joy and good spirits were spoiled by the unusual melancholy of the bridegroom. Whispers and looks were exchanged, accompanied by puzzled shakes of the head. The singing and the laughter grew less and less frequent, and there were dull pauses in the conversation. Finally, all cheerful talk stopped, and the conversation turned to wild tales of magic and stories of ghosts. One melancholy story followed another, each one even gloomier than the last. The Baron nearly caused several ladies to have fits when he told the frightening story of the beautiful Leonora, who was carried away by the goblin horseman. It is a horrible story, although it has since been written as excellent poetry. It is read, and probably believed, by people all through Germany. The bridegroom listened to the tale of Leonora with particular attention. He watched the Baron closely as the story came to an end, He began to rise gradually from his chair. He seemed to grow taller and taller, until the Baron almost imagined he had grown into a giant. The moment the tale was finished, the guest breathed out heavily and said a formal goodbye to the gathered company. They stared at him in surprise. The Baron was totally shocked. "What? Going to leave the castle at midnight? Why, a room has been prepared for you, and we expected you to stay the night." The stranger shook his head in a melancholy and mysterious way. "I must sleep in a different place tonight." There was something in this reply, and the tone in which it was said frightened the Baron. But he repeated his invitation for the guest to stay. The stranger shook his head silently, in a very definite way, at every offer. Waving goodbye to everyone, he walked slowly out of the hall. The aunts were alarmed, and the bride hung her head as tears ran down her face. The Baron followed the stranger to the outside court of the castle. When they had reached the faintly lit door, he paused and spoke to the Baron in a hollow tone of voice. "Now that we are alone," he said, "I will tell you why I am going. I have a formal engagement to keep." "Why can't you send someone else?" asked the Baron. "I cannot. I must attend in person. I must go to Würzburg Church." "Very well," said the Baron with determination. "But not until tomorrow. Tomorrow you can take your bride with you." "No, no," replied the stranger, in an even more serious way. "My engagement is with no bride. It is with the grave. The grave expects me. I am a dead man. I have been murdered by robbers. My body lies in Würzburg. At midnight I am to be buried. The grave is waiting for me. I must keep my appointment." He jumped on his black horse, raced across the castle bridge, and disappeared in the night. The Baron, returning to the hall in absolute confusion, reported on what had happened. 2 ladies collapsed at once. Others felt sick at having eaten with a ghost. Some people suggested he may have been the wild soldier from an old German country tale. Some talked of mountain spirits, of forest animals, and of other ghostly creatures, which have always been known to the people of Germany. One of the poor relations suggested that the young soldier was trying to avoid the marriage. This idea made everyone angry, particularly the Baron. How could anyone make such a crazy suggestion about his daughter? The silly relative had to recall his words at once and agree that the young man was indeed a ghost. Whatever doubts had been held, they were completely put to rest the next day. Regular messages arrived confirming the young count's murder and burial in Würzburg Church. The shock at the castle may well be pictured. The Baron shut himself up in his bedroom. The guests who had come to celebrate with him could not think of leaving him in his gloom. They wandered about the courts or collected in groups in the halls, shaking their heads at the troubles of such a good man. They sat longer at meals and ate and drank more than ever to keep themselves cheerful. The situation of the abandoned bride was the most upsetting. To have lost a husband before she had even kissed him, and such a handsome one. If a ghost could be so polite and sensitive, what would he have been like as a living man? The sound of her crying filled the castle. On the second night, the bride went to her bedroom accompanied by one of her aunts who insisted on sleeping in the room with her. The aunt, who was one of the best at telling ghost stories, had just fallen asleep in the middle of the long tale. The bedroom was remote from other rooms in the castle and looked down on a small garden. The niece lay silently watching the rising moon shining on the leaves of an ancient tree. The castle clock had just struck midnight when the soft sound of music floated up from the garden. She stepped out of bed and went quietly to the window. A tall figure stood among the shadows of the trees. As it raised its head, the moon shone a stream of light on the face. Horror! It was the ghostly bridegroom. There was a loud cry from the aunt who had heard the music and followed her niece to the window. As the aunt collapsed into her arms, she looked outside again. The ghost had disappeared. Chapter 5. Lost and Found. It was the aunt that needed calming, as she was very frightened about what she had seen. To the young lady, even the ghost of her lover seemed wonderful. He still looked handsome, and although the girl would have preferred a flesh and body bridegroom, his ghost was better than nothing. The aunt stated she would never sleep in that room again. The niece, for once, was quite definite in stating that she would sleep in that room and no other. The next night, before she went to the lonely bedroom, she made her aunt promise not to say anything about the ghost. For the young girl, it was the only pleasure she had left to see the ghostly form of her lover each night in the garden. How long the good old aunt would have kept her promise is not known, because she always loved to talk of unusual events and be the first to tell a frightening story. It is still talked about as a remarkable instance of female silence that she kept it to herself for a week. That is all she had to do, as one morning at breakfast, the news arrived that the young lady was missing. She could not be found anywhere in the castle. Her bed had not been slept in, and the window was wide open. She had disappeared. The shock and concern with which the news was received can only be imagined. Even the poor relatives stopped their constant eating for a moment, when the aunt, who had at first been struck dumb, screamed out, "The goblin! The goblin! She's been carried away by the goblin!" In a few words, she told about the frightening scene in the garden. She kept saying that the ghost must have carried off his bride. 2 staff members agreed with this, as they had heard the sounds of horses' feet around midnight. There was no doubt that it was the ghost on his black horse, taking the bride away to the grave. Everyone believed this to be true, because history has shown that events of this kind are very common in Germany. What a terrible situation this was for the poor Baron! What a terrible problem for a loving father and a member of the great family of Katzenelnbogen. His only daughter had either been carried away to the grave or was married to some forest creature. What if they produced an army of goblin grandchildren? As usual, he was completely puzzled, and the whole castle was in a state of confusion. The men were ordered to search every road, path, and valley of the Oldenwald mountain. The Baron himself had just pulled on his boots, grabbed his weapon, and was about to climb on his horse to join the search when he saw something on the road. A lady on a light horse was seen approaching the castle, accompanied by an escort riding on a large, dark animal. She rode up to the gate and jumped from her horse. Bending down, she held tight to the Baron's knees. It was his lost daughter and her escort, the ghostly bridegroom. The Baron was amazed. He looked at his daughter, then at the ghost, and wondered if he had gone mad. The ghost looked quite different since his visit to the world of spirits. His clothes were impressive and set off his strong, tall body. He was no longer pale and melancholy. His handsome face was pink with health, and his large, dark eyes shone with joy and happiness. The mystery was soon solved. The escort was certainly not a goblin or a ghost. He introduced himself as Sir Hermann von Starkenvost. He explained his adventure with the young count. He said how he had hurried to the castle to give them the news of the count's death, but the Baron had not let him get a word into the conversation. The sight of the bride had completely delighted him, and to be near her for a few hours, he had let the mistake continue. He said he did not know how to find a proper way to leave the castle until the Baron's goblin story suggested an unusual way out. Because of the ancient quarrel between the 2 families, he kept his visits to the garden underneath the young lady's window secret. He had attracted her, won her heart, and carried her away in victory to be married. In any other circumstance, the Baron would never have allowed the situation to continue. He was a strict father and a determined enemy in the ancient family battles. He loved his daughter and thought she had been lost. He was delighted to find her still alive, and although her husband was from an enemy house, at least he was not a goblin. The Baron did not really agree with the soldier passing himself off as a dead man, but several old soldier friends assured him that every trick was allowed in the game of love. Also, he should pardon the young count because he had recently fought so bravely in the war. Everything was happily settled. The Baron pardoned the young couple on the spot, and the celebrations at the castle started again. The poor relations piled love and attention on this new member of the family. He was so brave, so generous, and so rich. The aunts were shocked that their system of strict behavior and duty should have failed so badly. They put it down to their lack of care in not having put bars on the bedroom windows. One of them was particularly disappointed at having her extraordinary story ruined, and at having to admit that the only ghost she had ever seen turned out to be human. The niece, however, seemed perfectly happy to discover her bridegroom ghost was a man of flesh and blood. And so, the story ends.
The Wedding Knell. Chapter 1. The Bride and Bridegroom. There is a church in the city of New York which I have always regarded with particular interest, because of a marriage performed there under very unusual circumstances. My grandmother happened to be at the church at the time, and telling about it became her favorite story. Whether the building now standing on the same site is the one to which she referred, I am not old enough to know, nor do I want to spoil the interesting story by reading the date on the tablet over the front door of the church. It is an elegant church surrounded by an open area of grass, on which stands a number of large stone columns and statues of every shape and size. Some of the statues and columns were given to the church by grateful members of the faithful community. Other even larger structures were given to mark important occasions in history. Many of these old statues are now reduced to a collection of broken stones, gathering dust as they spread across the grass. Even today, there would be many stories to tell about the quiet old church as it stands high above the busy city below. The couple to be married had previously been engaged 40 years ago. Since then, the lady had been married twice. The gentleman had been single all these years and was now well over 60 years of age. Mr. Ellenwood was a shy and private man. He was also selfish, like all men who only think of themselves, yet showed on rare occasions a warmth and affection for other people. He had been a student throughout his life. He was lazy mainly because his studies had never had a definite goal. He had no ambition to contribute either to general society or even to help himself. Mr. Ellenwood was raised as a gentleman and normally behaved in a proper manner. However, there were times when he broke all the common rules of society. There were so many variations in his character that, despite trying not to attract public attention, he often became the subject of common talk. When he had these wild fits of behavior, people wondered if there was a madness in the family. However, his behavior was not caused by madness, but simply by not having some definite purpose in life. The widow, Mrs. Dabney, was the opposite to her third bridegroom in everything but age. She had been forced to end their first engagement, and had then married a man twice her age. She was a loyal wife, and after the husband's death, she was left a huge fortune. She then married a man much younger than herself, and was taken to live in Charleston. After many unhappy years, she was widowed again. It would have been unusual to see Mrs. Dabney upset, as she had not been crushed or depressed by her early troubles, the first disappointment, the cold duty of her first marriage, and then the cruelty of her second husband. Mrs. Dabney was not a pretty woman, but was cheerful and wise in making the best of what remained of her life. People liked her all the more for the one failing in her character, one that made her look silly. She had no children, so she could not pretend to stay young by living through a daughter's beauty. However, she refused to grow old and ugly, and did everything in her power to stop the progress of age. As much as she struggled with nature, all the signs of aging appeared, and made her ridiculous efforts a source of amusement for other people. The approaching marriage of this experienced woman with such a simple man as Mr. Ellenwood was announced soon after Mrs. Dabney's return to her home city. There was also a false idea of romance in this late wedding of two early lovers, which sometimes makes a woman look a fool in trying to remain young. It was even more surprising for this shy man to be persuaded to marry and become the subject of so much public amusement. Despite all the general comments, the day of the wedding arrived. The ceremony was to take place in an open church and attracted so much publicity that the seats at the front and sides of the church were full of curious spectators. It was a normal wedding custom for the bride and bridegroom to travel to the church separately. Somehow, the bride and her attendants arrived at the church just ahead of the bridegroom. It was after the bridegroom, Mr. Ellenwood, arrived for the service that the main events of the story began. Chapter 2. The Tolling Bell. The heavy wheels of the old coaches were heard approaching the church. The bride with her bridesmaids came quickly through the church door. The whole group, except for the bride, was made up of young and happy people. As they walked up the broad aisle, their steps were as light as if they were at a dance, and not in a holy church. It was such a brilliant sight that very few people had noticed the extraordinary event that happened as the group entered the church. At the exact moment the bride's foot stepped in the door, the church bell swung heavily in the tower above her and tolled its deepest knell. The sound died away but returned with a heavy ring as the bride entered the main part of the church. "My word, what a warning!" whispered a young lady to her lover. "Absolutely," replied the gentleman. "I believe the bell has the good taste to toll by itself. Why is that old woman getting married? If you, dear Julia, were the bride, the bell would ring with joy. It rings only a funeral knell for her." The bride and most of the wedding party had been too busy getting into the church to hear the first warning stroke of the bell. They had continued their happy walk up the aisle. The beautiful dresses, the red coats, the hats with the gold decoration, the stiff underwear, and the silk materials were all shown off to the best advantage on people used to wearing such wonderful dress. They made the wedding group appear more like a bright picture than anything real. What a cruel contrast to the bride! Although she was dressed in bright and beautiful clothes, her face looked worn and tired, as if she had suddenly become old in comparison to the young beauty around her. Along the aisle they continued, when another stroke of the bell seemed to fill the church with a dark shadow that for a moment hid the bright group of people. This time the group hesitated, stopped, and stood closer together. Slight screams were heard from some of the ladies, and there was puzzled whispering among the gentlemen. The bride was very brave. She too had shaken in fright, as if the toll of the bell had struck her directly on the heart. With her attendants still in shock, the bride recovered herself and walked calmly up the aisle. The bell continued to swing, strike, and shake with the same slow beat as when a corpse is on its way to the grave. "My young friends here are a little shaken," said the widow with a smile to the minister at the front of the church. "So many weddings have been guided in with the happy ring of the bell, and yet turned out to be unhappy. I hope the reverse of that will lend me better luck." "Madam," answered the puzzled minister, "this strange happening reminds me of a wedding speech made by the famous Bishop Taylor. His services were so much about death and future trouble that he almost gave the new marriage no chance for happiness or success. It has also been the custom in various countries to put something sad in the wedding ceremony to remind us of the balance between life and death. We can draw a sad but useful moral from this funeral knell." Although the minister might have given a sharp moral lesson, he still sent an attendant to see why the bell was ringing and to stop the heavy sounds, even though the sounds seemed to suit this strange wedding. A brief time passed, during which the silence was broken only by whispers and a few quiet laughs from the wedding party. The public, after the first shock, was unkind enough to find the situation amusing. The young have less charity for old people and their silly ways than the old for the young. The widow was seen for a moment looking across toward a window of the church, as if searching for the tablet she had placed there in memory of her first husband. She shut her eyes and remembered another grave. 2 buried men, one at each side, were calling her to lie down beside them. Perhaps in a moment of truth, she thought how much better it would have been if she had shared years of a long and happy marriage with her first lover. The bell would now be ringing for her funeral, and she would be followed to the grave by the old affection of a husband. Why now had she returned to this first lover, when there was no affection between them? Still, the bell of death tolled so sadly that the sun seemed to turn pale. A whisper from those who stood near the windows now spread through the church. A line of funeral coaches was moving slowly along the street, taking a dead man to the cemetery, while the bride waited for a living man inside the church. Immediately after, sounds of the bridegroom and his friends were heard at the door. The widow looked down the aisle and took the arm of one of her attendants. Her thin hand held on with such force that the young girl shook with fright. "You alarm me, Mrs. Dabney," she cried. "Whatever is the matter?" "Nothing, my dear, nothing," said the widow. Then she whispered in her ear, "There is a silly idea that I cannot stop thinking about. I am expecting my bridegroom to come into the church with my first 2 husbands as attendants. Look, a funeral! Screamed the girl. Chapter 3. The Wedding. As she spoke, a dark line of people walked into the church. First, an old man and woman, like chief mourners at a funeral, dressed from head to foot in black, except for their pale faces and white hair, entered. He was leaning on a stick and supporting the old woman with his thin arm. Behind them appeared another couple, and then another pair as aged as black and as mournful as the first. As they came near, the widow recognized in every face some feature of long-forgotten former friends. Now they were returning, as if from their graves, to warn her to prepare a burial cloth, or to show their ancient faces and body weakness, and then claim her as their associate by the signs of her own decay. She had danced many happy nights with them in her youth. For one moment now, as a sad old woman, she felt they would all do a death dance together to the music of the funeral bell. While these aged mourners walked along the aisle, the spectators shook with an unknown fear. Many looked away while others stared firmly ahead. A young girl screamed and fainted. When the funeral line reached the front of the church, each couple separated slowly and stood back against the sides of the wide aisle. Down the center walked a dark figure. It was the bridegroom in his shroud. Nothing but a shroud could have better suited that figure of death. The hollow eyes shone like the funeral lamp placed at a burial, but every other part of the shrouded body looked as one ready for the grave. The corpse stood very still, but spoke to the widow in a voice that kept rhythm with the toll of the bell, which rang slowly as he spoke. "Come, my bride," said those pale lips. "The funeral coach is ready. The minister stands waiting for us at the door of the burial chamber, so let us get married and go to our funeral." How can we describe the widow's horror? How could she be the bride of a dead man? Her young friends stood shaking in fright at the mourners, the shrouded bridegroom, and the widow herself. Imagine the whole scene, the useless struggle against human pride compared to age, illness, sadness, and death. The awful silence was broken by the minister. "Mr. Ellenwood," he said kindly, but with authority in his voice, "you are not well. Your mind has been troubled by the unusual circumstances in which you are placed. The ceremony must be cancelled. As an old friend, I ask you to please return home." "Home, certainly, but not without my bride," answered Mr. Ellenwood in the same slow voice. "You consider this wedding a joke, or even madness. Had I dressed my old and broken body with fine clothing, or had I made myself smile at this woman I don't love, that might have been a joke or madness. Consider this. Which of us has come without wedding clothes, the bridegroom or the bride?" He stepped forward slowly and stood beside the widow, his awful shroud contrasting with the bright red dress she had chosen for this unhappy ceremony. No one watching could deny the strength of the moral which his confused mind has demonstrated. "Cruel, cruel," groaned the shocked bride. "Cruel," he repeated, losing control in a wild burst of feeling. "Judge which of us has been cruel. In youth, you robbed me of my happiness, my hopes, my aspirations. You took away everything that mattered to me and left me not caring where I went or what I did. Now, after 40 years, when I am ready to die, you call me to get married. Other husbands have enjoyed your youth, your beauty, your love, and everything about you. What is left for me but your old age and death? This is why I am here in my shroud, to marry you in a funeral service, so that we can enter the door of the burial chamber together." It was neither madness nor merely the words of strong emotion on someone not used to them that now affected the bride. At that moment, she grabbed the bridegroom's hand. "Yes," she cried, "let us marry, even at the door of the burial chamber. My life has been empty and wasted. At its end, I have one true feeling. It is how I felt when I was young and deserving of you. Time means nothing now. Let us be united forever." The bridegroom looked at the bride with tears in his eyes. How strange that a rush of human love could come from the cold heart of a corpse. He dried the tears with his shroud. To the bride he said, "I have been angry all my life. Now the suffering has returned to haunt me, but we must forgive and be forgiven. It is late in our lives, and we never shared our early dreams of happiness. Let us hold hands and say that although we were separated in life, we meet again just as we are leaving it, and find our affection changed into something holy. How important is time in a never-ending union? Many people cried with the emotion of the moment as these two holy souls were united forever in marriage. The line of ancient mourners, the white hair of the bridegroom in his shroud, the pale face of the old bride, and the tolling bell drowning out the marriage words all marked the end of human hopes. As the ceremony progressed, the organ, as if influenced by this impressive scene, poured out a song mixed first with the unhappy knell, then rising to a loud high note. When the awful ceremony was over, the bridegroom and bride, cold hand holding cold hand, walked slowly out of the church as the organ's notes of formal victory drowned out the wedding knell.
Tom's Husband. Chapter 1. Expectations of Marriage. I won't bore you talking about the situation that led to the marriage of Tom and Mary Wilson. To them, their engagement was perfect, but to everyone else, there was nothing unusual or special about the arrangement. After Tom and Mary had married, they found their perfect situation had changed and become very ordinary. Instead of their tasks being divided, they now had twice as much work to do. They felt some anxiety about this realistic view of marriage, and instead of being peaceful as before, they now had new duties to consider in their combined lives. Tom and Mary looked back at their engagement with pleasure, as they had been longing to have each other to themselves. Now they had a slight feeling of disappointment about their loss of freedom and kept saying to each other how wonderful it was to be married. In truth, there were some private reservations from them both as to whether this was absolutely true. There was some disappointment in their expectations of marriage, as sometimes the expectation of an occasion is more enjoyable than the occasion itself. Although Tom and Mary weren't aware of it, they were really happier than most married couples due to their great capacity for enjoyment. Tom and Mary each had enough money to live on before they were married, although Tom had more than Mary because his father had once been a wealthy man. Mr. Wilson had been a manufacturer, but the business had failed mostly due to the fault of other people. When he died, his business affairs were in such a mess that it was difficult to be accurate about the extent of his income. Mrs. Wilson, Tom's stepmother, suffered a severe breathing problem and was often ill, but her condition was relieved by living in another part of America. When Mr. Wilson was alive, Mrs. Wilson had mostly stayed at home. Now she lived in Philadelphia with her own family. She approved of Tom's marriage to Mary and occasionally came to stay with them. Mrs. Wilson had property of her own, so she did not need to rely on Tom for financial help. Tom had a sister who had married a naval officer and now lived in Japan. It is often noticed when people marry that friends or relations consider one or the other to have made a poor choice of partner. In this case, the public opinion was that Mary could have done better for herself. Mary did not think like this as she had never considered any other career, and as she was the only child in her family, she had usually done what she wanted. Mary had been born with a very good idea of business, and it was often said that it was a pity she didn't have to work for her living. Her father always said it was a pity his daughter had not been born a boy, because such good organizing skills are often wasted on a woman. It may make her too independent to be a good wife, as most men like dependent women they can protect. Tom Wilson, however, liked the independent qualities of Mary and loved her for herself. Tom was a collector of almost everything but money. For most of his life, he had been disabled following an accident in his father's mill. He had been to school, but his vision became so poor that he could not continue. He lacked purpose and had no real direction in life except to make Mary Dunn his wife. It seemed that he would never distinguish himself as he did little each day, except through reading. However, this only occurred on the days he could see well enough to do so. Tom and Mary lived very happily in the house belonging to Tom's stepmother, who had always expected Tom to bring his wife home to the beautiful old building that she owned and Tom loved. One evening, Mary was reading the mail, which included a long and complaining letter from Tom's sister in Japan, saying that her share of their father's income was very small. Her American friends wrote and told her that many small mills were once again becoming productive. A large amount of money was tied up in their father's mill, and his sister was disappointed that Tom was not getting a manager to start their own mill again. She said that her husband, being a naval captain, had to entertain many people. The entertainment was expensive, and it cost them much more to live than it did Tom and Mary. She asked Tom to discuss the mill with their stepmother, who had equal control over the father's will. Tom worried about his sister's letter. He said to Mary that he was not a businessman and that the mill would need a lot of money to start up again. His father had meant to replace the machinery some time ago, as it was old and out of date. They would have to bring in people from Canada to work the mill, or he wondered, would local people be available or want to work there again? My sister seems to think we would make huge amounts of money as our father did when we were small children. Mary replied, There is still a large number of people in the village who worked in the mill before, and we could at least ask them if they are interested in returning. Jack Town asked me the other day if you were going to start up in the spring. Tom moved in his chair and sounded annoyed when he said, Mary, I'll put you in the manager's job if you like. Mary threw the newspaper at him. Tom threw it back at her in a good mood again. Do you know, Tom, I have been seriously considering everything? I would like nothing better in the world than to be the manager of a large business. I hate housework. I always have, and would be very happy if I never had to do it again. If you get rich when the mill is operating again, I will ask for someone to do all the housekeeping for me. I don't look after the house nearly as well as you did before I came here. Tom smiled. That is quite true, Mary. I have been very patient with you and can't keep giving you instructions on how to cook our food or do other household tasks. However, I'm not planning to take charge of the kitchen. Chapter 2. The Mill. Of course, said Mary later to Tom. It seems the right thing for me to look after the house and cooking. But some days I feel very down about it all. I never know what to cook for breakfast and don't really care how much dust lies about the furniture. I look upon keeping a house as my life's great trial. They both laughed at this. I think I might do it instead of you, Mary. To tell you the truth, said Tom, I have always enjoyed looking after a house. The staff knows their jobs well and will help me. Mary Wilson smiled as if she had only half heard what Tom was saying. She tapped her feet on the floor and stared at the fire. Well? Asked Tom after he had waited patiently as long as he could. Tom, I'm going to suggest something to you. I really wish you would take over our housework and let me start the mill. I am sure I could manage the job, and of course, I will ask experienced people to help me. There is nothing I would like to do better. I'll finance the mill myself for a year, and if it goes well, you can pay me back then. If not, you can make other plans. So I am going to be the wife and you the husband? Asked Tom, a little annoyed. Do you think you can do more work in one day than I can in 3? Do you realize that you know absolutely nothing about running a business? And never will, said Mary in good humor. Tom, I can learn a good deal better than you, as I like business and you don't. Remember, from the age of 12, I was my father's assistant. And remember, too, that I have never lost any of our money that I've invested. People will laugh, said Tom. Of course people will laugh, said Mary, but they will think I am lucky to have married a man who lets me do as I choose. My idea is good, and you will enjoy looking after the house as you did before. I hate work in the house, and while I am doing it, I am wasting my good business skills. What does it matter what other people say? Mary, I don't like the idea of you mixing with all those businessmen. They will all say I'm a fool, and my pride will suffer a big fall, said Tom. Mary, everything you have been saying is just ideas. No, the old mill needs a man in charge, and once it is running again, I intend to sell it." Mary didn't answer. A day later, she said, "I have decided to open the mill again immediately. I will go and see the men who worked there before, particularly those who were in charge of the different sections." Tom looked worried but didn't reply. Mary handed him the house keys and set off in her carriage for the village. Tom thought he would ride after her and bring her back in shame. After all, she had not waited for Tom's decision about the mill. When he calmed down, he decided that Mary did seem to know what she was doing, and he might as well go along with her plan and take charge of all the household duties again. Tom directed the staff to take all their instructions from him in the future. He told them that Mrs. Wilson is going into business and will have a lot of other things to think about. The two women were very curious and excited about the new situation, but they could see that Tom looked happy and seemed satisfied about his wife. Tom went out to the stable, climbed on his horse, and hurried after Mary's carriage. When he reached the village, he found Mary talking with Jack Town, who had been a manager of the mill during Tom's father's time. Jack looked very surprised and pleased. "Well, Jack, did Mrs. Wilson tell you she's going to start the mill? You must give her all the help you can." "I will," said Jack Town. "I don't care so much about getting work myself," Jack explained. "My wife and I have enough money for our needs, but the mill will provide work for the young people around here. I must say, however, that I would like to work in the old place again, and I've missed the mill since it shut down." "I don't know much about the business yet," said Mrs. Mary Wilson, who didn't understand the terms Jack used to describe the machinery and rooms at the mill. "By the time the mill is ready, I will be ready too." After a long delay and sums of money put into the business at steady intervals, the mill started up again. Mary said she had never been more satisfied in her life and was pleased she had a husband who had not laughed at her efforts. "I did laugh," said Tom. "It is better than crying when all the money is gone." Mary remained calm and said that was not likely to happen. It would not have been realistic to expect the mill to make money in the first year, although Tom's sister and husband kept writing and requesting financial help. Sometimes when business people came to the mill, they were amazed at having to talk with Mary, but they soon came to respect her skill and her success. She was helped by the old clerk who had previously worked for Tom's father. She was laughed at, as she had expected to be, and people said Tom should be ashamed of himself for not keeping his wife at home. However, after a time, people became used to the new situation. It was not long before Mary understood everything about the mill, and by the end of the second year, she declared a small profit. She also had good luck, and by the end of the third year, she was making money for herself. Letters of appreciation began to arrive from the family in Japan, and it seemed they were now entertaining more instead of less. Chapter 3. Tom Takes Charge. For some time, Tom enjoyed life and went calmly on his quiet way. He was anxious at first, for he thought that Mary was going to lose his money and her own. Also, he feared that his wife was growing successful as a business person at the risk of losing her female nature. As time went on and as he found that that was not happening, he accepted the situation. Tom became interested in collecting coins, a hobby that took up most of his free time. At last, his house, which had almost kept itself and had given him little to do besides ordering the dinners, suddenly became a great worry to him. Catherine, who had been the main helper of the family for many years, died after a short illness, and Susan, the other staff member, married one of the workers in the mill. Mary did not say so, but it seemed to her that Tom was growing very particular about the housekeeping and took more notice of the small details than ever before. She wished more than once, particularly when she was tired, that he would not talk so much about the house. It seemed to be the only subject that interested him. In the beginning of Mary's interest in the mill, she had made it a rule to discuss every subject of importance with Tom, but it had quickly proved not to be necessary. He tried hard to show a deep interest in the mill, which he did not feel, so Mary gave up telling him much about the business. She said that she liked to drop business discussions when she came home in the evening and fell into the habit of having a nap on the library couch while Tom, who could not see to read at night, sat smoking in front of the fire. Although Tom had little interest in the business world and still less knowledge of it, after a while he wished that his wife would tell him more about what she was planning and doing or how the business was progressing. He felt that she thought far more about her chief assistant, old Mr. Jackson, than she thought about him. He did not want her to think that he was not interested in the state of his own property. It made him feel like a dependent old man, although when they had guests at the house, there was nothing in her manner that made anyone think that she had become the head of the family. Tom and Mary's situation was unusual, and we could expect to hear eventually of a change. An old woman neighbor called out to Tom one morning as he was driving down to the village in a great hurry to collect his mail and asked him if she could borrow a cup of flour. Tom became angry immediately but told her to go and see his cook. This slight delay, besides hurting his pride, caused him to lose the mail, and what was even more annoying, the week had been wet and the washing would not dry. Mary came home to dinner in a very good mood, which annoyed Tom again, as he was not happy after his difficult day. Mary had met an old school friend and her husband driving home from the hills. After taking them over to her factory, which they enjoyed with great amusement and delight, she had then brought them home to dinner. Tom greeted them politely with his usual good manners, but the minute he saw his wife alone, he complained. "I do think you might have remembered that the girls in the kitchen are very busy today, and I really wish you would take a little more interest in things at home. I don't know what sort of dinner we can give your friends. Did you think of bringing home some meat?" Mary was hungry but said nothing except that she didn't mind what they ate and suggested they could have some canned soup. Mary often went to town to buy or look at cotton or to see some improvement in machinery. She often brought some beautiful bits of furniture and new pictures for the house. She also always included something that would interest Tom. Tom, however, felt that Mary could get on quite well without him when it came to the deeper wishes and hopes of her life, and that her most important concerns were all matters in which he had no share. It seemed to him that he had completely merged his life with her life. Tom lost interest in things outside the house and grounds. He felt himself getting out of touch with what was happening around him and felt that he had missed out on a great deal in life. He was a failure. One day, the thought came to him that these feelings had been almost exactly the experiences of most women, and he wondered if life really was any more disappointing and lacking in pride to him than it was to women themselves. "Some of them may be content with it," Tom said to himself. "People think women are designed for housework by nature, but I don't know why I ever made such a fool of myself." Having seen his situation in life now from such a different angle, he felt it day by day to be even more disappointing and wondered what he could do about it. Drawn by a strange new understanding, he walked across to his little family cemetery. It was one of those days that sometimes comes in early November, when the sun seems pale and sad. He sat for a long time beside his mother's grave. That evening, his stepmother, who was visiting, mentioned that she had been looking through some boxes of hers that had been packed away in the attic. "Everything looks very nice up there," she said in her breathless voice, and added without any deliberate insult to his feelings, "I do think you have always been an excellent housekeeper, Tom." "I'm tired of such nonsense," he exclaimed with surprising anger. "Mary, I want you to arrange your business so that you can leave it for 6 months at least. I'm going to spend this winter in Europe." "Why, Tom, dear," said his wife appealingly, "I couldn't leave my business." She caught sight of a look on his usually calm face and said nothing more. 3 weeks from that day, they sailed.
The celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. Chapter 1. A Captive Audience. In answer to a letter of request from a friend of mine, I called on friendly, chatty old Simon Wheeler. I was asked to inquire from Simon about a man my friend had known as a young fellow, called Leonidas W. Smiley. The following pages describe the long reply to the request. I have a secret suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is simply an imaginary figure. I doubt that my friend ever knew such a person, and that he could predict exactly what would happen if I asked Wheeler about Smiley. It would remind the old fellow of another long story. And another Smiley. This was a story about a Jim Smiley. Wheeler would bore me nearly to death with some never-ending memory of Jim Smiley. Wheeler would bore me nearly to death with some never-ending memory of Jim Smiley, for as long, dull, and as useless as it could possibly be to me or anyone else. If that were my friend's plan, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler sleeping comfortably by the warm stove in the ancient, run-down pub of Angel's Camp. I noticed that he was fat and had no hair on his head, but he had a gentle and innocent expression on his calm face. He woke up and said, "Well, good day to you." I told him a friend of mine had asked me to make some inquiries about a very dear friend of his named Leonidas W. Smiley. I understand that the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley was at one time a young minister of the church and resident of Angel's Camp. I added, if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would be very grateful to him, and I could write to my friend with the information. Simon Wheeler looked delighted, backed me into a corner, and blocked me there with his chair. He then sat me down and listed every single detail of the long and involved story which follows. There was no smile on his face, no gesture or variation of expression, and not once did his voice change from the gentle tone in which he had started the tale. There was no sign of any enthusiasm, but all through the constant story, he sounded absolutely sincere. This showed me clearly that in no way did he imagine that there was anything odd or humorous about his story. Instead, he regarded the whole tale as a serious and important matter, and admired its two heroes as men whose skill in magic put them above the ordinary person. To me, the sight of a man calmly telling such a funny story without smiling was particularly amusing and ridiculous. As I said before, I asked Wheeler to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. Wheeler made no mention of the good Reverend Smiley, so I let him tell the story of his Smiley in his own indirect way, and never interrupted him once. He replied as follows. There was a fellow here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't remember exactly, although what makes me think it was one or the other of those years is because I remember the big water channel wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. I've never seen a man quite like Jim Smiley since that time. He had the strange habit of betting on anything and everything that he came across. If he could get anybody to take up the bet against him, he would. If he couldn't persuade anyone to take up the challenge, he'd change sides and bet the other way. Any way that suited the other man would suit him, and providing he got a bet, he was satisfied. Even so, he was lucky, very lucky, as most times he would come out the winner. He was always ready and looking for a chance. There wouldn't be a single situation mentioned where Jim wouldn't offer to place a bet, and he would take any side, if you please, as I was just telling you earlier. If there was a horse race, you'd find him with a big pile of money, or find him without a cent at the end of the day. If two dogs were fighting, Jim would bet on the result. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet that one cat would scratch more than the other. If the chickens were picking at each other, he would bet on the number of tail feathers lost. If there were two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you on which one would fly away first. The betting didn't stop with the animals or birds. If there was a camp meeting, Jim would always be there. He would bet that Mr. Walker, the minister, would be better than anyone else around at urging everyone to be good. It was quite true. Mr. Walker, being such a good man himself, had more success in the camp than any other man of the church. If Smiley watched an insect sliding off somewhere, he would bet you on how long it would take the creature to get wherever it was going. If you took up the bet with him, he would follow that insect as far as Mexico or New York, if that's where the insect wanted to go. There are a lot of people around here who have seen Jim Smiley in action, and can tell you just as many stories as I can about his amazing bets. He never worried about other people or what they thought about it all. The odd fellow just had to bet on anything and everything. Some time ago, Minister Walker's wife became very ill, and it looked as if she might even die. One morning the minister came in, and Smiley asked how she was. The minister replied, "She is much better, thank the Lord for his great pity and concern. In fact, she is coming on so well that with continued good fortune she will completely recover." Smiley spoke without thinking and said, "Well, I'll bet $100 she doesn't anyway." Chapter 2. Introduction to Dan Webster. Simon continued, "This Jim Smiley had a horse. The boys called her Old Go-Slow. But that was only in fun because she was faster than that. He used to win money on that horse, even though she was very slow and always had breathing problems, an infection, or bad lungs, or something of that kind. They used to give her a 200 or 300-yard start, and then catch up to her and pass her. At the very end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate and come racing in toward the finish line. She'd be jumping and kicking her legs in the air, or sometimes out to one side along the fence. She kicked up more dust and made more noise than any other horse in the race, with her coughing and sneezing and blowing through her nose. As far as you could see in the rush of horses, she would always end up at the finishing post just about a neck's length ahead of the others. Smiley had a small dog with a flat sort of face. To look at the dog, you'd think he wasn't worth a cent. He was just there to hang around and wait for a chance to steal something. As soon as money was bet on him, he became a different dog. He would stick his jaw out and open his mouth wide to show his sharp teeth. Dogs would attack him, annoy him, bite him, and throw him over their shoulders 2 or 3 times, but Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the dog, would pretend that that's what he expected to happen. The owners of the attacking dogs would then place more and more bets down, sometimes even making the bets double until they had no more money left. Then, all of a sudden, Smiley's dog would grab the other dog by the skin of its back leg and hang on to it. Not to chew it or bite it, mind you. He kept hanging on until the other dog couldn't fight any more. I reckon that dog could have hung on for a year, if that's what it took to win the fight. Smiley always came out the winner with that dog, until the day the poor creature grabbed a dog that didn't have any back legs because the dog had been accidentally cut off with a chainsaw. When the fight had gone along far enough and all the betting was finished, Andrew Jackson made a grab for his favorite hold. He saw in a minute how he had been tricked, and how the other dog had all the fighting power and luck on his side. Andrew Jackson looked surprised and unhappy, hung his head, and gave up trying to win the fight. He got beaten badly that day, and gave Smiley a look as much as to say his heart was broken. And it was Smiley's fault for matching him up with a dog with no back legs. The back legs were, of course, what Andrew Jackson depended on to win a fight. The poor animal was so upset that he wandered off, laid down, and died. It was a good dog, that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived, for he had courage and was very clever. I know that because a dog that had never been taught wouldn't be able to fight in those circumstances if he didn't have skill and brains. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight and the way it turned out. I always wonder why Smiley matched up Andrew Jackson with a dog with no back legs. I don't know if he was thinking straight or not. As well as dogs, Jim Smiley had many cats. Cats taught to catch rats, inside cats, and ordinary backyard fighting cats. He also had every other sort of animal you could think of. There were chickens and every kind of creature with 4 legs you could imagine. There was nothing you could think to bet on that Jim Smiley didn't have. He caught a frog one day, took it home, and said he planned to educate the animal. For the next 3 months, all he did was sit in his backyard and teach the frog to hop and jump. And you better believe it, he did teach him too. He'd give that frog a little push from behind, and the next minute, you'd see that frog sailing through the air like a flat cake. If he got a good start, you'd see the frog turn over once or more in the air and come down flat on his feet like a cat. Smiley got him to jump high enough to catch flies, and made him practice so often that he could catch and eat every fly he could see. Smiley did a very good job of educating that frog. I never did see any other frog that could do those things. Smiley said to me that all the frog wanted was education, and that he could do almost anything. I believed him, because I had seen him set Dan Webster down on the floor, Dan Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Dan, flies!" As quick as you'd like, he'd hop straight up and eat a fly off the table, then drop down on the floor again, as steady as a lump of dirt. He'd start scratching the side of his head with his back foot, as free and easy as if he had no idea he'd been doing anything any other frog might not do. I've never seen a frog so plain and simple, for all that he was so clever. When it came to fair and square jumping on dead level, Dan could get over more ground at one hop than any animal of his kind you've ever seen. Jumping on a dead level was his strongest skill, you see. That clever frog would win every time. It was also very exciting to watch Dan jump. When it came to the test, Smiley would raise the amount of money on the bet. Smiley was extremely proud of his frog, and well as he might be, for fellows who had traveled all over the world said Dan Webster was the best jumping frog they'd ever seen. Chapter 3. The Failed Jump. Smiley kept the frog in a little box with holes in it for air, and he used to take him to town sometimes and ask anyone to place a bet on him. One day, a fellow, a stranger in the camp, came across Smiley holding the box with the frog inside. "What have you got in that little box?" Smiley says in his easy way, "It might be a bird, or it might be a chicken, but it isn't. It's only just a frog." The fellow took hold of the box, looked inside carefully, turned the box around this way and that, and says, "Oh, so it is. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says in a quiet and natural way, "he's good enough for one thing. I can guarantee he can jump farther than any frog in the whole of Calaveras County." The man took hold of the box again and took another long, close look, and gave it back to Smiley and said in a very deliberate way, "Well, I don't see any qualities about this frog that are any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," said Smiley. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't. Maybe you've had experience with them, and maybe you are not an expert in frog behavior at all. Anyway, I know what I'm talking about, and I've got my opinion. I'll risk $40 that he can jump farther than any frog in Calaveras County." The fellow looked at Smiley, thought for a minute, then looked at the frog again and said in a sad kind of voice, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I haven't got any sort of frog. But if I had a frog, I'd certainly place a bet with you." Smiley said, "That's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." The fellow took the box, placed down his $40 along with Smiley's, and sat down to wait. So the stranger sat there for a good while thinking to himself. Suddenly he opened the box, took out the frog, looked at the animal's big mouth, and then forced the mouth wide open. He took a small spoon and filled the mouth full of lead shot, filled him right up to his chin, and set him down on the floor. Smiley had gone to the pond where he had to walk around in the mud for a long time trying to catch a suitable frog. He didn't want to get a frog that would be too easy for Dan, but he also didn't want to get a frog that might be smarter than Dan either. He knew there was no other frog as educated as Dan in Calaveras County. Finally, he caught one, put it in a bag, and came back to the stranger who was waiting. "Now, if you're ready," said Smiley, "put him down next to Dan, with his front feet just even with Dan, and I'll give the word to start the competition." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, jump! And the two men gave the frogs a push from behind. The new frog hopped high in the air and jumped a huge distance. Dan took a big breath, blew up his shoulders like a man lifting weights. It was no use. He couldn't move. He was fixed to the ground like a big lump of heavy metal, and nothing he tried could get him to move from where he sat, blowing hard. Smiley gave him a few more pushes, but Dan just sat as heavy as lead. Smiley was very surprised and annoyed as well, but he didn't have any idea what the matter was, of course. The fellow took the money and started to walk away. As he was going out the door, he pointed his thumb back over his shoulder at the frog glued there to the ground and said in a deliberate kind of way, "Well, I still don't see anything about that frog of yours that is any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan a long time. At last he said, "I do wonder what in the name of fortune stopped that frog jumping in his usual way. I wonder if there's something the matter with him. He looks a bit sick somehow." Smiley bent down and caught Dan by the back of his neck and lifted him up and said, "Well, blow me down. He must weigh 5 pounds or more." He turned Dan upside down and shook him. There was a loud noise, and out came a huge stream of lead shot. Then Smiley understood what had happened. He was so angry that he put Dan down and set off after the man who had cheated him in a fair bet. He never caught the fellow, but... Here, Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and got up to see what was wanted. He turned to me as he moved away and said, "Just sit where you are, stranger, and don't hurry away. I'll only be gone a few minutes." By this time, it was very obvious that to hear more of the story about the friendly rogue, Jim Smiley, wouldn't give me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. So I got up and started to move away. At the door, I met the wordy Simon Wheeler returning from the front yard. He trapped me again, told me to sit down, and went on with the story. "Well," said Simon Wheeler, "that Smiley had a yellow cow with one eye and no tail, just a little bit left waving like a flag, and—" "Oh, hang Jim Smiley and his strange cow," I said under my breath, interrupting Wheeler before he could start again on another long tale. I wished the old gentleman good morning in a pleasant way and left as quickly as possible. Yellow cows indeed. 1,000 Deaths. Chapter 1. Rescue from Drowning. I had been in the water for about an hour. I was cold, exhausted, and had a terrible pain in my right leg. I thought I was going to die. Struggling without hope and without success, I could see the line of lights along the water's edge. I gave up trying to cross the current and thought instead about my wasted career, now that my life was coming to an end. It had been my luck to be born into a family of good English background. I was born of parents whose knowledge of money was far greater than their knowledge of nature and raising children. Even though every material need and wish was met, there was no love for me, or any sign of a happy family life. My father was an educated man, and known as an authority of old goods. He gave no thought to his family. He was always involved in the ideas and practice of his business. My mother, known far more for her good looks than her good sense, satisfied herself with the admiration of the society in which she spent most of her time. I went through the regular school and college routine of a boy from a conventional English family. As I grew older and found an interest in girls, my parents suddenly became aware that I was a young man with normal feelings, and tried to discipline my behavior. It was too late. I made the most terrible and public mistake, and my parents would have nothing more to do with me. I was also ignored by the society I had disgusted for so long. My father gave me money and said that he never wanted to see or hear from me again. With this money, I paid for a passage on a ship to Australia. Since then, my life had been one long journey from one corner of the earth to the other. Now I found myself, a strong, healthy sailor of 30 years of age, drowning in the San Francisco Bay because of a very successful attempt to desert my ship. My right leg was stiff with cold, and I was suffering extreme pain throughout my body. A slight wind stirred up the rough sea, which washed into my mouth and down my throat. I could do nothing to stop swallowing most of the water. Although I still managed to float, I was quickly becoming unconscious. I have a faint memory of floating past the wall at the side of the bay and catching sight of a light on a boat sailing up the river. After that, I remembered nothing more. I heard the low noise of insect life and felt the gentle air of a spring morning blowing on my cheek. Gradually, it blew with a regular flow to which my body seemed to respond with a soft movement. I floated on the gentle summer sea, rising and falling with faint pleasure of each comfortable wave. Suddenly, the movement grew stronger, and the noise of the insects grew louder. The waves became higher and higher, and I was thrown about on a stormy sea. A huge pain struck me, and I was conscious of brilliant flashes of light and the sound of rushing water in my ears. A strange and sudden feeling caused me to wake. The scene, of which I was the main character, was an unusual one. I could see that I lay in a very uncomfortable position on the floor of a boat. On either side, grabbing my arms and working them up and down like pump handles, were two men with dark skin. An apparatus had been tied around my head, which connected my lungs to the machine I will describe in a moment. My nose, however, had been closed, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see two tubes. They were similar to small pipes, but made of a different material. The tubes came from my mouth and went off to either side of my body. The first came to a stop and lay on the floor beside me. The second crossed the floor in a number of turns and was connected to the apparatus I am about to describe. I was familiar with the general equipment of the laboratory, so I understood the machine now attached to me. It was made of glass and was the sort of apparatus used to do experiments. A container of water was surrounded by an air chamber, to which was attached a vertical tube holding a glass bowl on the top. In the center of the bowl was a measuring instrument. The water in the tube moved up and down, causing air to come in and out and to reach me through the tube in my mouth. With this apparatus and the help of the men who pumped my arm so hard, breathing had been continued artificially. As my chest kept rising and falling, my lungs continued to be supplied with air until my natural breathing could start again. Chapter 2. Surprise Meeting. I opened my eyes as the apparatus around my head, nose, and mouth was removed. I drank a large glass of alcohol and struggled to my feet to thank whoever had saved my life. To my surprise, it was my father who stood next to me. Many years of meeting danger had taught me to control myself, and I waited to see if my father would remember me. He did not. I just seemed to be an ordinary sailor who had deserted his ship, and that is exactly how I was treated. Leaving me to the care of the natives, my father read the notes he had made on my artificial breathing. They had served me a grand meal, and I could hear a lot of chaos and confusion on deck. I could hear ropes being moved about on the boards outside. The sailors were singing as they did their work. From the noise and activity, I realized we were getting ready to sail away. What a joke this was going to be. I was going on a trip with my severe father into the wide blue Pacific Ocean. Little did I realize, as I laughed to myself, who would be the center of the joke. If only I had known, I would have jumped over the side of the ship and even welcomed the awful boat I had just deserted. My life on the awful boat would have been much better compared to what I was about to face. I was not allowed outside my room until we had passed certain landmarks, and the last pilot boat had returned to the bay. I appreciated this consideration from my father and thanked him in the most appropriate way I knew of a sailor. I had no idea that he had his own plans in keeping my presence secret to everyone but his sailors. He told me briefly of my rescue by his men. He assured me that there was no debt on my side, as having found me was his good luck. I still did not understand fully what he was going to do with me. He had made the apparatus to prove a theory about how the body reacts in certain conditions, and had been waiting for an opportunity to try it out. He said finding me was his good luck. "You have proved it beyond all doubt," he said, then added with a protest, "but only in the small matter of drowning." He then offered me an advance of £2 on my previous wages to sail with him. I considered this generous, as he really did not need my help on board his ship. I had expected to sit with his men for meals, so I was surprised to find myself eating at the captain's table. He noticed that I was not a common sailor, and I wanted to take this opportunity to get on his good side. I decided to take this chance to win back my father's approval. I made up a story about my education and why I had been in the water. It was not long before he noticed my interest in science, so I became his assistant, with another increase in wages. Before long, he told me more and more about his theories, and I became as enthusiastic as he was himself. The days passed quickly as I was very interested in my new studies. When I was not in my father's library, I listened to his plans or helped him in his laboratory work. There were many interesting experiments we could not do because of the rolling motion of the ship. He promised me, however, many enjoyable hours in the wonderful laboratory on the island to which we were going. He had realized the island was not marked on any of the maps, and had it converted to a scientific laboratory. We had not been on the island long before I discovered I was in a terrible situation. I will describe the strange things which happened later, but first I must briefly describe the causes of the most alarming experiences that could happen to anyone. Late in life, my father had lost interest in old goods and had become much more interested in science. He had studied all the basic rules of biology as a young man, and now wanted to explore areas of science never examined before. It was his plan to be the first person to make these discoveries. It was at this stage of his investigations that we had met again. I understood all his ideas and experiments and was becoming as mad about them as him. The excellent results we achieved later showed that he certainly was not mad. He was the cruelest human being I have ever known. My father understood both the physical and mental functions of the body. His ideas led him to a much wider range of study which was, at that time, quite unknown. He began studies in the chemistry relating to carbon and other sciences. He studied the nature and causes of diseases, and was interested in the study of poisons. He also examined many other subjects that were related to his ideas. He started from the suggestion that the direct cause of temporary and permanent death was due to the clotting of certain elements and mixtures in the living contents of a cell. He had discovered and tested these ideas many times through several complex experiments. He found that the temporary arrest of a living creature produced unconsciousness, and a permanent arrest caused death. He stated that by artificial means the clotting of the cell elements could be slowed down, prevented, or even reversed at a late stage. He argued that death, when it was not violent and if none of the organs suffered injury, was merely life stopped for a short time. In such cases, life could be started again by the use of suitable methods. His idea was to discover a method, through practical experimentation, and prove that he could start life again in a person who appeared to be dead. Of course, he realized that life must start again before the person's body had started to decay. For his experiments, therefore, he had to use people who had just died minutes before. In an informal way with me, he had proven this theory with his breathing apparatus. I was really dead when his crew rescued me out of the water in the San Francisco Bay. Chapter 3. Constant Dying. With the experiments in mind, my father had sailed away for a year, keeping only the 2 native men to help him with the boat. Now I will explain his evil ideas concerning me. He first showed me how completely I was in his power. He described his theories in detail to me, and how he would like to gain further proof that his ideas were correct. Then, he made the terrible statement that I was to be the subject for his experiments. I had come face to face with death and danger in many desperate situations, but never one as serious as this. I am certainly not a coward, but this suggestion of dying many times and being brought back to life filled me with horror. I asked for time, which he granted, but he kept telling me that I would have to do as he wished. Escape from the island was impossible, and I did not want to kill myself. I thought later that dying might have been easier than having to go through the experiments. My only hope was to destroy my guards. This idea was not possible because of the measures taken by my father. I was watched, day and night, by the 2 native men. He would not listen to my arguments. I told him I was his son. That was my last chance to persuade him, but he was like a cold machine. Not a warm and real father. I cannot imagine why he married my mother or had me, for there was not the smallest amount of emotion in his cruel nature. Something that could be proved, like science, was all he understood. He had no love or pity. He only considered these human weaknesses that must be overcome. He said to me that in the beginning, he had given me life, and now he had every right to take it away. He said, however, that was not his plan. He merely wished to borrow my life occasionally, promising to return it exactly at the arranged time. Of course, mistakes could happen, but the lives of men were full of such chances, and I would have to take mine. For the experiments to succeed, he wanted me in the best possible health. I was put on a diet and treated like a man before a major contest in sport. What could I do? If I had to do the experiments, I might as well be in the best possible condition. During my rest times, my father allowed me to help in setting up the apparatus and assist with some small experiments. You can imagine the interest I took in this work. At least, I sometimes had the pleasure of seeing some of my suggestions or changes put to use. After such experiments, I would smile to myself, thinking how I was actually arranging my own funeral. He began his experiments with a series of tests, using poisons. When the apparatus was ready, I was killed with a strong dose of a poison, used to depress the nervous system. I was allowed to lie dead for 20 hours. During that period, my body was absolutely dead, as all breathing and circulation stopped. The awful part of it was that while the clotting of the blood cells proceeded, I remained conscious. I was able to experience all the horrible details. The apparatus used to bring me back to life was a tight chamber made to fit my body. It worked in a simple way. There were several small structures that controlled the flow of water. A turning metal bar with a handle and an electric motor. The air inside the apparatus was damp and pure, and filled my lungs without having to be connected to the tubes as in the previous system. Though my body was not moving, and for all I knew in the first stages of decay, I was aware of everything that happened. I knew when they placed me in the chamber. Even though my senses were dull, I was aware of substances being put into my blood to act upon the clotting process. Then the chamber was closed and the machinery started. I had never felt such fear. However, the circulation gradually returned, and the body organs began to function again. An hour later, I was eating a large dinner. I did not enjoy this series of experiments or the experiments that followed. After 2 failed attempts to escape, I decided it would be better to take an interest in what was happening. Anyway, I was becoming used to it all. My father was delighted with his success, and as the months passed, his theories became more extreme than ever. We tried the main classes of poisons, the nerve poisons, the nerve gases, and the poisons that excite the nervous system. We completely avoided the poisons that break down the body organs. I became quite used to dying, and there was only one incident that shook my confidence. My father made a number of small cuts in my arm, and introduced a tiny amount of the very dangerous nerve poison that is normally used to coat poison arrows. I became unconscious immediately, and my breathing and circulation stopped quickly after this. The clotting seemed to be advanced, and my father gave up hope of saving my life. At the last moment, he tried a new method of bringing me back to life. This was so successful that he was encouraged to keep repeating the experiments. He placed a magnet in a glass jar from which the air had been removed. When rays of light from different directions were shown on the magnet and then stopped, no light remained in the jar. No atoms were released from the magnet. All that remained were very dull rays, which were able to go deeper into the body than any of the other known rays. Using this equipment, he photographed my body. On the negative, he found shadows of chemical and electric movements. This was proof that I had not really died. Except for the nerve poison, none of the other poisons had left any side effects. Chapter 4. Atomic Brilliance. Another series of awful experiments concerned electricity. By passing strong shocks through my body, we proved a theory that high currents were absolutely harmless. As this did not affect me, the current was reduced, and I quickly suffered a major electric shock. My father allowed me to remain unconscious for 3 days. It took 4 hours to bring me back. Once, he introduced an infection that caused fits, but the pain of dying was so great that I refused to take part in any similar experiments. The easiest deaths were by cutting off my air supply, and deaths by drugs that made me fall into a deep sleep were really quite enjoyable. One time, after stopping my air supply, he kept me in a cold room for 3 months. He did not allow me to freeze or decay. This was without my knowledge, and I was shocked later to find how long I had been unconscious. I became afraid of what he might do with me as I lay dead. My fear was increased by the interest he was developing in cutting me open. The last time I was brought back to life, I discovered that he had been making cuts in my chest, although he had sewed the cuts together. The pain was so severe that I had to stay in bed for a week. It was during this period that I made my plan for escape. While pretending to be interested in the work, I asked for and received a break from the constant dying. During this break in the experiments, I did some laboratory work for myself. My father was too interested in cutting up the animals caught by the natives to notice what I was doing. It was on 2 theories that I worked out my plan. I knew, of course, that water is made up of 2 parts. My first theory was that these parts can be changed into gas by the use of electricity. My second theory was something I had read about. There is a force that is opposite to the force that pulls objects toward the center of the Earth or Moon. A famous scientist had proved that this second force actually sends the objects away from the center of the Earth. Attraction to the Earth, for instance, only pulls the objects together, but it does not combine them. However, atomic or molecular attraction not only pulls the objects together, but combines them. I wanted to find the opposite force to this atomic or molecular attraction, a force that instead of combining objects, splits them apart. Not only did I want to discover and use this force, but I wanted to be able to use it whenever I chose. Water is formed when the molecules of the 2 elements contained in it act on each other and then separate and create new molecules. When electricity is applied to the molecules, it causes the molecules to split up and return to their original separate elements. The force I wanted to find must not only do this with the 2 elements of water, but with all elements, no matter in what form they exist. If I could then invite my father within its range, he would explode into a mass of separate elements and be sent flying across the room. Eventually, I was able to control this force. I found it did not destroy the substance it was working on, but only the form of the substance. I also discovered that it had no effect on structures that did not contain carbon. To the structures containing carbon, it was total destruction. This puzzled me at first, but after I thought about it a bit more, I realized why it was happening. There are many more atoms in the molecules containing carbon than the number of atoms in the molecules without it. This means that the molecules containing carbon are not stable. They are more likely to split and explode when they are attacked by physical forces or chemical substances. By using 2 powerful batteries connected with special magnets built for this purpose, 2 enormous forces were fired out. On their own, they were quite safe, but together, they achieved their purpose by joining at a point in the air after they were fired. After testing the batteries and magnets and almost blowing myself into tiny pieces, I lay my trap. I hid the magnets so that their force made the whole area of my bedroom door a field of death. I placed a switch beside my bed, where I could turn on the electric current from the charged batteries. Then I went to bed. The 2 native men still guarded my sleeping quarters, one replacing the other at midnight. I turned on the current as soon as the first man arrived. I had just fallen asleep when I woke upon hearing the noise of a metal chain. There at the door laid the collar from the neck of my father's huge dog. My guard ran to pick it up. He disappeared like a puff of wind, his clothes falling in a pile on the floor. There was a faint trace of gas in the air, but since his body was made up of a mixture of 3 gases which have no color or smell, there was no other sign of his departure. Yet when I turned off the current and removed the clothes, I found a deposit of animal carbon and other powders containing the firm elements of his body. I set the trap again and got back into bed. At midnight, I stepped out of bed and removed the remains of the second native guard. I then slept peacefully until morning. I woke up to hear the demanding voice of my father who was calling to me from across the laboratory. I laughed to myself. There had been no one to call him, and he had slept beyond his usual time. I could hear him crossing the floor with the intention of waking me. So I sat up in bed and waited. I wanted to see every bit of the change to his body, or should I say, I wanted to see him disappear into nothing. He paused for a moment at the door, and then took his final step. Puff. It was like the wind blowing through the trees. He was gone. His clothes fell in a strange pile on the floor. I noticed a faint smell like a burning match. A little pile of hard matter lay among his clothes. That was all. The wide world lay before me. I was free of my father forever. Eclipse. Chapter 1. Preparation. The eclipse of the sun, which you have asked me to describe, occurred on Monday, the 16th of June, 1806. Its greatest depth of shadow fell on the American continent somewhere around the angle of 42 degrees from the equator. I was on a trip to visit my parents, who still lived in our old family home, located in the high country of Otsego. It was in that part of the country where the eclipse was most impressive. My memories of the great event and the events of the day are as sharp as if they had happened yesterday. Lake Otsego, where the Susquehanna River starts, lies as close as possible to where the shadow of the eclipse would fall. The village, which has been the home of my family for many years, is placed in a beautiful position at the foot of the lake. It lies in a valley between two mountain ranges that are almost the same height. The clear Susquehanna River flows quickly from the southern shore of the lake. It is crossed by a high wooden bridge. The bridge divides the main street of the little town from the gardens and fields on the eastern bank of the river. Here was everything that could be desired from nature. There was a lake, river, mountains, trees, and homes of the people. All these features showed the full effect of the varied movement of light and shadow through that impressive day. Throughout the area of country to be darkened by the eclipse, the whole population was in a state of nervous excitement for weeks before the event. On the evening of the 16th of June, our family could not think or talk about anything else. My father was still alive then, and my 4 brothers were at home. To kill time, we walked up and down the wide hall of the house, or sat at the family dining table. As it can be imagined, our conversations were entirely about the movement of planets, stars, and eclipses. We were all enjoying the feeling that we would experience a grand and extraordinary sight, probably a sight which millions of other people would never see. It might have been selfish to think that we were to have more luck than other people. I think our interest in science, however, stopped us from being entirely selfish about the coming event. There were many guesses about the weather as the evening approached. Everyone had a different opinion about this important subject. A passing cloud might hide the full view from us, or rain could spoil the special moment of the eclipse. I was more confident about the weather than my neighbors. We were one of the very few families in the state at that time to have an instrument for measuring air pressure. This instrument was carefully consulted all through the day, and each reading indicated dry weather. We were relieved to see so many stars in the sky that night before going to bed. The first thing we did the next morning was to open the windows and again examine every inch of the sky. I got out of bed early and found the sky calm and with no sign of clouds. The day had arrived, but the shadows of the night still hung over the valley. For a moment, I looked at the familiar view. The clear lake with its beautiful setting among the farms and green forests. I saw the peaceful bay, surrounded by the hills where I had climbed every rock and cave many times when I was a young boy. It was as dear to me as the face of a friend. It seemed that the summer landscape had taken on a special quality. It had never looked so beautiful, even though the shadows of a major eclipse would cover every tree and every wave within a few hours. There was one object in the landscape which a stranger would probably not have noticed, or might even have called ugly. It was a familiar sight to everyone in the village. It was a tall, gray, dead tree, without branches, and was known by the local people as an ancient and rough guide to the east. It had been standing on the top of the eastern hill since people first started living in the village. It still stood straight, even though it had been blown about by many storms. When I was a child, I pretended it was a flagpole. Perhaps it was a symbol of freedom for the country people of an earlier generation. Now, as a young man and a sailor, I looked at the familiar branches of the tall tree with its unusual shades of silver and gray. It became for me the sail of a ghost ship. I remember greeting it with a smile, as it was the first thing I had recognized in the old forest since I had returned home. Suddenly, I saw an object that was far more interesting. I discovered a star, a single star, shining faintly in a sky which had now changed to a pale gray half-light. Bright touches of pink were beginning to show in the eastern sky. There were no clouds to be seen, not even the smallest shadow. I was very interested in that lonely star, and continued looking out the window in a sort of dream. I knew that stars were part of the planetary system. However, What did I actually know about planets such as the sun and the moon? My brain was confusing itself with forgotten ideas of size and distance. What was the time required by light to enter the dark space that lay between heaven and earth? I also wondered if there were people who lived on planets, with feelings and ideas like my own. Soon the sun came into view. I noticed an orange light glowing among the branches of the trees on the eastern mountain. I watched the colors increase in the sky and the gradual lighting of the surrounding hills, as I had done 100 times before. The rough outline of the trees, nearly 200 feet in height, showed against the sky on top of the hills. The golden light of the morning moved silently down the front of the western mountains. It gave clear views of woods and fields until lake, valley, and village all lay smiling in the cheerful glow of the warm sun. Chapter 2. Excitement on the Watch. Our family gathered early and was soon joined by friends and relations, who were all enthusiastic and excited. Each person was provided with a colored glass for viewing the eclipse. By 9 o'clock, the cool mountain air had gone, and the heat of summer filled the valley. The sky was still clear, and a better day would have been hard to find, even in this good climate. There was not a breath of wind, and we could see the rays of heat over the smooth surface of the lake. There was every sign of a hot and heavy midday. We left the house and walked across the grass into the broad and green street, which lay between our gates and the lake. Here, there were no branches hanging over the road to block the view. The sky, the trees on the mountains, and the clear sheet of water in front of us were all easily seen. As the time for the eclipse came closer, we tried to remain patient. Our enthusiasm and excitement increased to a high level. The older members of the group were discussing the details of an earlier eclipse. Leaving them to talk about their memories, I walked away, glass in hand, through the main streets of the village. There was hardly a house or a face that I didn't know in the little town. It gave me extra pleasure on this holiday at home to be sharing in the special excitement of the coming eclipse. Everything in the town was still quiet, although things were rather unusual for this time on a summer's day. Many people were busy with their usual jobs. Women and children were carrying buckets of water. People were sweeping their houses. I passed the shops and could hear the hammer of shoes being put on the horses' feet, and the sound of wood being cut to size. Teams of horses were carrying goods through the streets, and people were still doing their usual shopping. A farm vehicle with a heavy load of dried grass was crossing the bridge. The sleepy driver was coming in from the fields, with no idea of the changes about to take place in the sky above him. Most people, however, were on watch, as someone seemed to be looking out of a window at every house. Groups of people walked along the streets, looking up to the sky and talking with interest and excitement. We heard that there were 1 or 2 people who did not believe that there would be a total eclipse of the sun, simply because they had never seen one. Seeing is believing, we are told, although we could argue that this comment might not be true. None of us could persuade these neighbors of ours, who had not seen an eclipse, that it really would happen. Here was the importance of using reason and knowledge. These were people with fixed ideas and not willing to change them. I was interested to hear what one of these doubting people had to say about the eclipse, so for a bit of fun, I went looking for someone I knew. When I arrived, he was not at home, having left the village on business. As he had climbed on his horse that morning, he was true to his opinion. He declared to his wife that he was not running away from that eclipse. He then went on to say, with honesty, that if the eclipse did pass over him during his journey, then he would acknowledge that it was true. This, at least, was very positive. I had just returned to my family, who I had left on watch, when one of my brothers with very keen sight called out and said he could see a dark line on the western edge of the sun's disk. Everyone looked up immediately. Through the glasses we could now see a dull but definite object shading the light of the sun. A cry of satisfied delight came from everyone. We were not to be disappointed, as there was no cloud to hide the wonderful sight. A sight almost out of this world in its wonder was about to be revealed to us. In a very short time, the round shape of the moon was seen. Another cry of delight followed, as one by one we could all see the dark, round outline clearly against the golden light of the sun. Gradually, and almost at first without being noticed, the dark and mysterious shape moved across the sun. We had a feeling of wonder as we watched in silence. So far, there was no noticeable change in the light on the lake and mountains. The familiar scene was its usual bright and glowing picture, as on any other day in June. The people were now pushing into the streets, their usual jobs forgotten for the moment as they all looked upward. There was such a small change in the strength of the sun that it seemed more like an act of faith rather than a positive sight. Gradually, a fifth and even a quarter of the sun's disk became hidden. But the sun was still too bright for us to watch without the colored glass. With the protection of the glass, we could watch the progress of this rare event. The midday heat became less, and the cool of the early morning returned to the valley. I was looking upward, watching carefully at the first moment when the dark outline of the moon could be seen by the naked eye. A man I knew walked past. "Come with me," he said quietly, at the same moment taking hold of my arm and leading me away. He was a man of few words, and there was an expression on his face which caused me to go with him without a pause. He led me to the courthouse, and from there into a room in another building, occupied by two people. It was the figure looking out the window that caught my attention. It was a man with a tired face and chains around his arms. He was a prisoner under sentence of death, guarded by the man at his side. Chapter 3. Misery and Majesty. A very sad thing happened in our little town recently. The teacher of a small school outside the village had beaten a child in his care very severely and for a very small error. The child was a little girl, and actually his own niece. It was said that she had been born with a problem, which prevented her from saying certain words that the teacher wanted her to say clearly. The teacher did not think the child was making an effort to say the words correctly. He continued to beat her so severely that she never recovered from the effects of the blows and died a week later. The teacher was arrested, tried for murder, found guilty, and a date was set for his death. This was the first time the death sentence had been given in Otsego County. It made a very deep impression on people. Until the beating, the general character of the teacher had been very good in every way. It was beyond all doubt that he was deeply sorry for the crime which he had committed. He had acted from a false idea of duty, rather than from a fit of anger. He did not realize the physical injury he was causing the child. He was so sorry about what he had done that the public felt great sympathy for him. They had signed requests for a pardon, or at least for a delay in ending his life. These requests had been sent to the governor of the state. The day arrived for his death by hanging, without any word back from the governor. The governor was at his country house, at least 80 miles from Albany. The request had not been sent in until the last minute, to allow as many people as possible to sign the paper, and no one had calculated the time it would take to travel the 80 miles. No letter was received back, and it looked as if the death sentence would be carried out. The day arrived, and crowds of people from nearby towns poured into the village. They had come to watch the awful and still unknown sight of a public hanging. As I had looked down on the main street of the village that day, it had seemed to me that the street was a sea of human faces. The clock struck 12, and the prisoner was taken from the jail. He was seated, as is usual, on the box in which he was to be buried. He was carried to the place of hanging, sitting between two men from the church. His look of absolute misery was difficult to describe. I have seen other criminals hanged for their crimes, but I have never seen such an expression as the one that appeared on the face of this miserable man. When he saw the circle of rope, he stood up and turned his back on the awful object, squeezing his chained hands in horror. The priest from the church eventually managed to calm him down, and the last prayer was offered. The prisoner's own sincere response had just been spoken when a letter from the governor made a late arrival. A short pardon had been granted, so the prisoner was carried back to the miserable cell from where he had come in the morning. This is how the unhappy man, who had been brought from the prison, was able to see the wonderful eclipse. During the previous year, he had only seen the sun once, as the prisons of that time were underground and dark. I will never forget that miserable figure. I can picture him now, standing at the window, pale and thin from being locked up for a year. His cheeks were marked by the constant crying, and his whole body was worn by shame and deep regret for what he had done. Here was the contrast of a man at the lowest stage of his life, about to see the highest and most wonderful display of nature that could be revealed to the human race. The unhappy murderer seemed to stare upward at the extraordinary sight of the eclipse. It was as if he were recording a mental picture. He appeared to be overcome with feelings almost as painful as death, and could see the world beyond the grave. In his miserable state, he stood as still as a statue, with his chained arms lifted up to the sky. It would have been impossible to plan such a good human lesson as this. On one hand, there was the wonderful movement of the sun and the moon, and on the other, a picture of miserable human shame and regret. It was an incident to remember forever. And the lesson was not lost on me. When I left the courthouse, the country appeared to be an unusual dull yellow. A great change had taken place. The trees on the distant mountains were covered by the shadows from the strange sky and were no longer green. The lake had a bright look, which was very odd. All the animals were in a state of anxiety. The birds were flying about in great excitement, not sure of what to do, as it didn't appear to be the normal approach of evening. Even the dogs became worried and stood closer to their owners. The expressions of the people who had looked enthusiastic and interested earlier in the morning now changed. Some looked anxious or thoughtful. Others wore an expression of wonder, according to their individual characters. Now everyone came out of their houses. Every second it became darker and darker, and the children came running to their mothers in fright. The women themselves were looking about for their husbands. Most of the men were silent and serious, and as the darkness increased, many left their jobs to be near their wives and children. Once again, I stood beside my father and my brothers at the gates of our home. The sun lay at an angle to the south and east, in the best possible position for observation. I remember that I searched the whole gray sky for a cloud, but could not see a single one. It was one of those absolutely clear days, less rare in America than in Europe. The steadily failing light and the gradual approach of darkness became all the more impressive as there was not a cloud in the sky. The birds, which a short time ago had been flying about in great excitement, now seemed convinced that night had arrived. It was possible to see swallows flying down under the roofs of the houses. Pigeons flew home to their cages, and other little birds returned to their boxes. Through the open door of a small stable, we saw the chickens settling in for the night. The usual strength of the sun had now become much weaker, so we could look upward for a long time without hurting our eyes. The sun appeared like a 3 or 4 day-old moon, but with a larger and more brilliant curve. Looking to the west for a moment, a flash appeared in front of my eyes. For a second, I thought I had imagined it. But soon after, I could clearly see that it was a star. One after another, they came into view more rapidly than in the evening light. Altogether, about 50 stars appeared in a broad, dark area of the sky over the trees on the western mountain. This wonderful sight of the stars during the middle of the day was an exciting experience. Suddenly, one of my brothers shouted, "The moon!" I looked quickly toward the east again, and there was the moon, so clear in the sky that it was almost frightening. The round shape, the beauty, the whole appearance and content of the planet were as clearly seen as we had ever seen them before or have seen them since. The moon looked huge, dark, powerful, and majestic. It demonstrated this by its power to completely block out the rays of the sun. We may be adults, but at heart, we are still children. We judge objects in daily life by what we see. We usually think of the sun and the moon as sources of magic, light and delicate in nature. We saw the material nature of the moon so clearly that it changed all our previous ideas about the planet. The moon was not just a cloud or false shadow. It was a huge mass of material substance that separated the sun above us from the earth where we stood. The darkness of early night now covered the village. Chapter 4. Black Minutes. My thoughts turned to the sea. As I was a sailor at heart, I had a mental picture of what the eclipse would be like over the ocean. I could imagine the beauty and magic of the darkness falling over the bright water in the middle of the day. It would be hard to imagine a more majestic sight than the changes of light and shade over the waves during the eclipse. My mind was busy with thoughts of beautiful ships with white sails, and other ships of all shapes and sizes, sliding like spirits across the dark waves. I was brought out of my dreaming by a familiar and ordinary incident. I heard the dull step of animal feet on the village bridge. A few cows, thinking that it was already night, were coming home from the open fields outside the town. It is not surprising these gentle animals were deceived, as it had become much darker than the half-light of evening when they usually returned. The air was becoming very damp, even more so than the previous evening. It was so cold that there must have been a big drop in temperature since the heat of the morning. The lake, the hills, and the houses of the little town could not be seen in the darkness. The absence of the usual lights in the homes made the darkness even more impressive. All work had stopped, and the only sound that could be heard was the whispering voices of the people. "Listen, hear that bird?" asked a friend standing near me. As we listened in absolute silence, we heard the clear, sad note of the lonely bird of night. The sound was slowly repeated at intervals from the eastern bank of the river. The song of the summer birds, usually so loud in June, had entirely stopped for the last half hour. A night bat came flying above our heads. Many stars could now be seen, although there were not enough of them to alter the darkness. There was only one point in the far distant northern sky that the light of day appeared to remain. At 12 minutes past 11, the moon was most clearly seen. It appeared as a huge black circle, so nearly hiding the sun that no light at all shone through from that usually bright star. Behind the sun was a ring of light rays. The darkness of night had fallen. A quiet excitement and interest was felt by everyone. People seem to show more respect than usual for nature when they stare at all the wonders in the sky. They admire the peaceful colors after rain, the heavy clouds of a big storm, the bright flash of electricity, the falling star, and the beautiful arrangement of the northern lights. These treasures never fail to give people a feeling of wonder, something greater than looking at any of the sights on earth. There is a sense of interest and expectation connected with all the changing activity in the skies. It is a sense of wonder, which may be traced to the repeated words of the great religious forecasts. Perhaps they are whispering to our spirits and giving our physical sight a sense of mystery. I look back now to that impressive hour when I stood as a young man with my family and friends. As we shared the same sense of deep wonder, I have never been so sure that there is a presence greater than all of us. It was a good lesson for me. I realized I was just a very tiny part of the whole pattern of heaven and earth. I often think back to the day of the eclipse, that movement of the moon across the sun, and the darkness at midday is as fresh in my mind as if it had happened yesterday. A group of silent, dark figures had gathered nearby, all of us feeling the same emotion. My father stood very still, only 15 feet away from me, but I could not see his face. 3 minutes of almost total darkness passed. The minutes felt longer because of the strong thoughts and feelings that filled our minds. The feelings created by this majestic sight had been ones of wonder and respect. It seemed as if the great Father of the universe had deliberately covered his face in anger. As awful as the darkness had been, the return of the light from the sun was just the opposite. The ring of light above the moon became suddenly brighter, and the sky behind the moon could again be seen. The stars disappeared, and light began to show along the tops of the distant mountains. And then, a flood of light from the sun covered the whole valley. It was with a strength that would be hard to describe if you had not actually felt it yourself. There is no way I can compare the joy in the return of the sun after the eclipse to anything else I know. The only thing the eclipse could perhaps be compared to was the passage of a dark cloud across the sun. However, the eclipse was 1,000 times more effective. It seemed to have a spiritual quality, offering protection, hope, and pleasure in all the elements of the earth. It was not at all like the early morning or the actual rising of the sun. The change to darkness was not gradual. It was sudden and surprising, as if we were expecting to see a strange presence coming out of the sky. I know it is a silly thought, but to me, it seemed that the rays of the sun could actually be seen flowing out through the darkness. They came from the darkness to light up the forest, the mountains, the valley, and the lake with their glowing touch. There was another majestic movement, as the curve of the sun appeared again. and the moon could be seen moving on her path through the gap. Venus, the morning and evening star, was still shining as brightly as ever. To the naked eye, this second passage of the moon only remained for a moment. As it finished, I looked again at the scene around me. The street could now be seen and was filled with people from the village. Along the edge of the road that ran from the valley to the side of the mountain were 20 coaches carrying travelers. Behind them were teams of workers from the hills. They had all stopped on the road exactly where they were, out of an unconscious respect for the eclipse, as much as by a curious interest. Every face was turned toward the sky, and every eye took in the wonder of the sight. Men and women stood nearby me in the open street with tears running down their faces. The sound of the crying could be heard coming from every direction. Even the educated and thoughtful people continued standing in silence. It was several minutes before anyone was able to speak. At such a time, how could man deny the existence of a powerful presence? After the eclipse, I remember noticing the moment when I could see the grass on which I was standing. Later again, I watched the shadows of the leaves on the stone path. The white flowers in my mother's garden were the first objects seen by the family members who were looking out of the windows of our house. Every man and woman was soon delighting again in the welcome return of light, after that awful moment of midday darkness. People who see any extraordinary sight together usually enjoy sharing their impressions about it afterward. I do not remember one single person to have ever spoken about his or her feelings at the time of the eclipse. It would seem as if everyone's feelings were too personal to be discussed in a light or easy way. I have lived a varied and interesting life, and have met all sorts of people in my travels around the world. I have been lucky enough to see many events on land, in the sky, and on the ocean. But I can only say that I have never seen such a wonderful sight as the total eclipse of the sun. There could not have been a better lesson to remind me of how minor and ordinary we are, compared to the wonders and majesty of nature. Playlet, the failed jump.
Hello there. Where did you come from? A long way from here. Have you been traveling long? Yes, long enough. Welcome to our little camp. You can tie up your old horse over here. Thank you. Would you like a drink? We both would. It's a hot day. Are you planning to set up a gold claim? Maybe. If you don't try for gold, there is not much else to do. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Well, what else would you do? A bit of this and that. I don't know how much this and that there is to do here, but make yourself at home. It's a simple camp, but we welcome strangers. It's good to see a new face. What's in the little box? Now, why don't you have a guess? I'm not very good at guessing. Let's see. Holes in the top. Must be alive. You are right about that. Is it an insect? Insect? One of those useless little creatures? No. Try again. Snake? What? In this small box? Absolutely not. Well, it can't be anything much then in that little space. You can't say that when you don't know what's in the box. Why don't you tell me about it? I'll give you a clue. It likes water. Every living thing likes water. That's not a very good clue. It likes water and it hops. Don't tell me it's a frog. It's not just a frog. It's a very special frog. How? This is the best frog in the whole of Calaveras County. Let's have a look. There he is. It looks the same as any other frog I've ever seen. He's not the same as any other frog. Same color, same look. I can't see anything special about it at all. Maybe you know about frogs. Maybe you don't. Maybe you've had experience with them, but it doesn't sound like it to me. What is so special about this ordinary frog? Ordinary? This frog can jump farther than any other frog in the county and probably the world. That's some claim you're making. It's true. You should see him hop. Show me then. See that fly there? Watch. By the way, the frog's name is Dan Webster. Fancy name for an ordinary frog. Fly, Dan, fly. All frogs can do that. Not at all. This frog's been educated. Never misses a single catch. Educated? Hopping in the air doesn't mean it's educated. And it doesn't mean it can jump a long way either. Look, I've got my own opinion about all this. I'm willing to bet $40 that Dan Webster can jump farther than any other frog around. I'd place a bet with you if I had a frog, but, as you know, I'm a stranger here. I don't have any sort of frog at all. No frog, no bet. I suppose I'll have to ride on soon. Wait, now don't be in too much of a hurry to leave camp. Don't worry about not having a frog. I'll get you one. Here, hold on to the box for a few minutes. There's a pond over there. I'll get you a decent frog in no time. Just put your money down here next to mine, and I'll be off. Here you are, $40. Now we're set. Here you are. Right. That's very good of you. I'll wait here. I'm off to the pond to get a little frog. Just a little frog. Take your time. I don't mind waiting. It must be a suitable frog. A fair contest for a fair bet. I wonder. It looks like any other frog I've ever seen before, but what if it is really as good as he says? I sure could use an extra $40 and get my own 40 back. Come here, my little money winner. I have a surprise for you. Open your great big mouth wide. Wider. That's it. Now in we go. This lead won't be going anywhere. Nor will you, my heavy little friend. Just a little bit more. That's it. Now close that mouth. Done. Got you, my little jumper. Into the jar. Oh, you're out again. Come on, my little beauty. Come on. Jump this way. I've got you this time. In you go. What a good little frog you are. But not quite a match for our Dan. Had a bit of trouble catching him, eh? Could be he's a good jumper. We'll see. Here you are. Caught a good one. Put him down here next to Dan. Make sure their back feet are level on the line. I'll give the word to start. Ready? Yes. 1, 2, 3, jump! That's a good frog you got me. I don't understand it. Dan hasn't moved. What's wrong with him? He always jumps when I say jump. He's been educated. Look at him, just sitting like a lump. Hasn't moved a muscle. Come on, Dan. Take a breath and try again. As I said before, I can't see anything special about Dan. You can have my frog if you like. I won't need it anymore. You might like to educate this one. Well, I bet my money, and his frog won, so that's all there is to the contest. Can't understand it. To think of it, Dan does look a bit sick. I'll just have a closer look at you, Dan Webster. You must be ill or something. What's this? He weighs 5 pounds or more. Over you go, my friend. Lead shot? The cheating rat! It was a fair bet, and he tricked me when I had my back turned. I'd like to get my hands on him. And my $40. I don't think Dan will want to jump any more. All that education. and no more bets.